Chapter 3119. At the same time, as the overlord of the dynasty, the ruler had also reaped great benefits over the hundreds of millions of years. Back then, the countless flaws and loopholes left behind in his cultivation state that he had comprehended after understanding the crux of the worldview had been mostly fixed by him after hundreds of millions of years of growth. As for the various concepts that formed the worldview, he had concluded many of them during this process. Although he was still far from gathering them into a complete worldview, he was at least on the right path. With such a harvest, the current him could absolutely crush the him from hundreds of millions of years ago in terms of strength. Even if there were thousands of him from back then, they would not be able to resist him at all. However, the ruler was not happy at all despite having such a great gain. Instead, he would frown from time to time. For example, at this moment, he was frowning in the down notes that he had created and left his cultivation state. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he could already sense an existence that had reached a certain limit. This limit was that if he didn't find a new way out, he could only reach the peak of his current realm, at most with his current state. At least for now, he could not see any possibility of breaking through the peak. He had clearly opened up a brand new world, but it only revealed a small part of it before it stopped abruptly. How could he be satisfied with this feeling? However, what could he do even if he was dissatisfied? Over the years, he had been able to come into contact with completely different worldviews through the communication between this dynasty and the other lawless lands. These worldviews came in all shapes and sizes, but they were all logically self-consistent. Even if they seemed completely incomprehensible and illogical at first glance, after careful study, one would find that behind these incomprehensible and illogical appearances, there was a deeper layer of logic. It was precisely because of these countless worldviews that he was able to summarize enough concepts so smoothly to make up for the flaws and loopholes left in his cultivation state in the past. That was why his cultivation state could improve so much in such a short period of time. However, it was precisely because he had come into contact with so many worldviews that he knew how grand a complete worldview was. Only then did he realize how difficult it was to summarize a complete worldview. With his current perception ability, research ability, and the many worlds and worldviews he could see, it was still not enough to support the ideas he had concluded and obtain some sort of crucial transformation. On the other hand, if he was unable to complete that transformation, then his cultivation would naturally be unable to complete the corresponding transformation, and he would be limited to his current level. This was the source of his distress. I've already transcended the world. What else can I do next? Don't tell me I'm going to transcend with the entire void? Such a thought flashed through the dynasty's ruler's mind. Those who do not plan for eternity will not be able to plan for a moment. If one did not think about how to achieve the next breakthrough and how to step into a higher level and only followed the waves in a muddle-headed manner, their final achievements would definitely be limited. Before the possibility of reaching a higher level could not be found, naturally, the dynasty's ruler could stay at that level with a peace of mind. However, he clearly knew that there was a higher realm, and there was more than one higher realm. How could he be so lazy? It went without saying that he wanted to transcend with the entire void. The reason he could break through to the Supreme Emperor stage was because he wanted to transcend with everything in his dynasty. As such, when he could not find a way to break through at all, it was only natural for him to follow his previous experience. How do I transcend with the void? No, it's impossible for me to transcend with the void. In that case, do I have to transcend with the land without any family? The dynasty's ruler could not help but feel chills run down his spine as he thought to this point. He had no idea how to transcend with the void at all. He could not find a starting point at all, just like how he could not find a way to break through to a higher level at the moment. However, if the second possibility was to transcend with the endless world, the situation would be enough to make him despair. Although transcending with the world was much more traceable compared to the previous ulcers, it seemed like he only had to expand on the process of transcending with the entire dynasty. Even his train of thought was considered rather complete, so there did not seem to be much difficulty at all. However, when the expansion was from a world to the land without any family, the increase in difficulty was clearly enough to make any existence despair. What did the land without any family mean? Even if it was not really an infinite world, since it could be described as a land without any family, it meant that the number of worlds must be unimaginably great. It even surpassed the understanding of ordinary living beings. That was the only way to describe it, as a land without any family. If he wanted to transcend with this unimaginably large number of worlds, the difficulty was clearly several times greater than the difficulty of transcending with an entire world. If that was the case, even if transcending with an entire world was an extremely simple matter in the beginning, it would become impossible to transcend with a land without any family. Moreover, transcending with a world was not a simple matter in the first place. That was the exact reason why the dynasty's ruler felt chills run down his spine when he thought about how he might only have a chance to break through if he transcended with a land without any family. He felt like he was drowning in despair. It can't be like that. There must be another way. It's just that I haven't found it yet. After a long while, he dispelled this despairing possibility. He believed that since a higher realm existed, there would definitely be someone who could reach it. There would definitely be some way to make a breakthrough. Even if there really was a way to transcend with a land without any family, it was definitely not the only way. While the dynasty's ruler was extremely vexed about whether he could step into the next realm, Venerable Yuan had already finished saving this part of the world in the second layer of the island's branch. Compared to the scene of devastation when she first stepped into this world had already returned to its original state after hundreds of millions of years of nurturing. The countless fragments that had been shattered had already reunited under her divine power. As for the originally extremely fragile space-time, it had already stabilized under her methods. As for the aspect of life, after so many years of creation and nurturing, there is already an extremely prosperous ecosystem in this world. As for the intelligent civilization, it had already flourished to a certain extent. It was enough to form a virtuous cycle in this world. As it continued to grow, it also helped this world to continuously sublimate and transform. On this day, Venerable Yuan stood in the depths of space-time and looked down at this world that was like a completely different world compared to before. Such a thought flashed through her mind. At this moment, her cultivation realm was still at the peak of the supreme emperor realm. Although she was the reincarnation of a sixth tribulation powerhouse, because she wanted to completely break free from the shackles of her previous body, she could not cultivate according to her previous body's cultivation path at all. She could not directly copy her previous body's worldview. Since she could not copy her previous body's worldview, she could only obtain enough nutrients from the path of a Tao sovereign to support herself and sort out a brand new worldview that belonged to her now. And obviously, because of Luo Fan's imprisonment, she could not leave this branch of the island at all. Naturally, she could not obtain sufficient nutrients, and, of course, she could not break through the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm and become a tribulation powerhouse. The current situation of this world had clearly been completely saved. Moreover, with the various inheritances that she had left behind, even if this world encountered a tribulation, as long as the living beings in it did not seek death, it would not be a big problem for them to pass through the tribulation. From this point of view, it could be said that she had already saved this world completely. If this method of salvation was still not enough to satisfy the existence behind this branch of the island, she probably did not know how to satisfy the existence behind this branch of the island. As these thoughts flashed through her mind, she no longer hesitated, and the transcendence light began to gradually spread out from her body. Along with the transcendence light, her figure began to gradually enter the transcendence path that this world had left behind. Gradually, she disappeared from this world and stepped into the transcendence path that she had been longing for a long time. The moment she stepped into the transcendence path, the second layer of the world trembled slightly, as if there was an indescribable reluctance and sorrow that appeared out of nowhere. The living beings in this world felt as if they had lost something at this moment, and an even stronger reluctance and sorrow surged in their hearts. Clearly, although Venerable Yuan Bai did not save this world for all living beings, regardless of whether it was for the living beings or for the world, they had already remembered her merits. And at this moment in the Transcendence Path, two more ulcers appeared in front of Venerable Yuan Bai. One was to step into the next layer of the world, and the other was to enter the first layer of the path of a Tao sovereign. Among them, there was no obstruction in entering the next layer of the world, and it was placed in front of her with great ease. However, there was a barrier blocking the entrance to the first layer of the path of a Tao sovereign, clearly refusing her entry. It's still not working? Did I guess wrong? Did I not do enough? Venerable Yuan Bai could not help but feel indescribable anger when she saw the barrier. She had spent hundreds of millions of years doing things that she did not want to do, only to find out in the end that what she had done was very likely to be useless. How could she not be angry? With a slight thought, she directly crashed into the barrier, wanting to forcibly break through it and step into the Transcendence Path that led to the first layer of the path of a Tao sovereign. Originally, she only crashed into the barrier because she wanted to vent her anger. Deep down, she did not actually expect to really break through the barrier and enter the Transcendence Path that she had been longing for. However, the development of the situation was somewhat beyond her expectations. This barrier was not like the barrier that she had encountered before, which did not waver in the slightest when she crashed into it. Instead, the entire barrier seemed to have weakened by many times, and it actually began to tremble under her impact. Moreover, the structure of the barrier itself began to deform and continuously cave in. This situation made it seem that the barrier was already somewhat unable to withstand the impact, and as long as she exerted a little more strength, she would be able to directly break through the barrier. Before she could think about the current situation, the barrier suddenly bounced and directly ejected her into the Transcendence Path that led to the next layer. When she came to her senses, she had already appeared in the third layer of the island, suspended above the void of the third layer. What happened just now? The barrier seems to have weakened a lot. After arriving here, her mind was still stuck in the Transcendence Path, constantly recalling every detail that she had encountered before. Yes, it's definitely because the barrier has weakened by 4%. This is the use of saving the world. After saving a part of the world, the barrier will weaken a little. As long as enough worlds are saved, the barrier will completely collapse and disappear. At this moment, Venerable Yuan Bai had already roughly summed up the rule. Thinking of this possibility, she could not help but feel extremely excited. How difficult was it for her to save the world? At most, it would just take a little more time. If saving the world a few times could allow her to bypass the restrictions behind the island, it would be too easy. As these thoughts flashed through her mind, she focused her attention on the world in front of her. At this moment, she was even looking forward to the world in front of her, still being broken. Such a world clearly needed her to save, and it would become her merit, enough to allow her to bypass the restrictions of transcendence. Unfortunately, things were not as perfect as she had imagined. Although this part of the world was not very prosperous, at least compared to the second layer of the world after she had saved it, it was not broken. In this world, be it the world itself or all living beings, they all occupied their respective positions and perfectly carried out their duties as a part of the cycle of the world. Chapter 31:20. At this time, in the place that seemed to be in the branches of many islands at the same time, but also seemed to be completely not in any of the branches of the islands, Luo Fan focused his attention on a certain cultivator that originally didn't attract his attention at all. Horan? 1? W? 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 R? A? and W? E? Na? C? O? M? That was the ruler of the dynasty who had transcended with the entire dynasty. The choice of the dynasty's ruler was beyond his expectations. Before this, he had never thought that a cultivator would be able to transcend with a part of his world. After all, compared to transcending alone, transcending with the entire world was thousands of times more difficult. Normally speaking, no cultivator would choose this method of transcendence that was thousands of times more difficult than the normal method of transcendence. However, the ruler of the dynasty chose this way in the end. What surprised Luo Fan even more was that the benefits he obtained after doing this were many times more than he had imagined. Normally, for Luo Fan, or for the island and its branches, transcending was the second choice, which was more beneficial. In other words, it would be more beneficial for the island or its branches if the person who transcended stepped into the next layer of heaven and earth. However, it was obvious that this was the case for Luo Fan, the island, and its branches. For the existence who transcended, it was obvious that the first choice would be more beneficial. In other words, it would be more beneficial for him to choose the Tao Master Path. After all, the power, cultivation realm, knowledge, and information that the cultivator carried would inevitably affect the next layer of heaven and earth after entering the next layer of heaven and earth. It was difficult to distinguish whether this kind of influence was good or bad for the world in a short period of time, but in the long run, it was obviously very beneficial for the world. For the cultivators themselves, the next layer of heaven and earth was obviously not different from the previous layer of heaven and earth. What they could obtain in the next layer of heaven and earth was obviously already available before transcending. In this case, what benefits would it bring them if they chose to enter the next layer of heaven and earth? Compared to this, the situation was obviously different if he chose the first option, which was to merge into the path of Tao Master. Choosing to be a Tao Master was equivalent to completely loosening all the shackles that shackled him. From then on, although he dared not say that his cultivation would be smooth. However, at the very least, he had cleared the path ahead. From now on, as long as he found the right method and worked hard enough, he would be able to improve. Therefore, it was obviously very beneficial to the cultivators themselves. However, this choice was obviously not the same for the world, the island, or the branches of the island. After all, if a cultivator were to transcend into the next level, they would still belong to this island or a branch of the island. Although it would be a different world, there would not be any changes in essence. If a cultivator chose to join the path of a Tao sovereign, it was obvious that he would completely leave this island or its branch. From then on, everything he had would no longer have anything to do with this island or its branch. This was, of course, a great loss to the island. Before the ruler of the dynasty ascended with his dynasty, there were at least hundreds of millions of cultivators who had transcended on the island. Among so many cultivators, even if some of them chose the second option when they transcended for the first time, after learning the outcome of the second option, they would all choose the first option in some other time, which was to leave the island or branch off from the island. In the end, apart from the 6 tribulation cultivators who couldn't make the first choice, there were very few cultivators who had transcended on the various islands that remained. Only a very small number of cultivators who had made the wrong choice, but did not have the chance to make a second choice stayed on the island's branch. There were so many people who had transcended, but in the end, only the ruler of the dynasty had created a new choice. How could Luo Fan not pay attention to him? He actually found a new possibility. Looks like I've overlooked a lot of things before, thought Luo Fan as he looked at the ruler of the dynasty. Before the ruler of the dynasty broke through, he had never thought that the island he had created and the island's branch would have the possibility of breaking through to the peak of the Supreme Emperor stage. After all, this was not the continent of the tower that he had created in the previous level of the Tao Master stage. The reason why the continent of the tower could allow cultivators to step into the realm above the tribulation stage was because there was an opportunity left behind by a true divine in the continent of the tower. At most, the Spire continent would only transform those opportunities and fuse them with the other continents. In other words, the world that Luo Fan had created seemed to allow cultivators to reach the realm above the tribulation stage. But in essence, it was because of the opportunity left behind by the true divine that they could break through. If that was not the case, there would not have been so many cultivators from a higher level who had sent their friends and relatives to the continent of the tower to cultivate. After all, splitting the heavens and earth was a piece of cake for existences above the tribulation stage. If creating a world could allow cultivators to step into the realm above the tribulation stage, would the sixth and seventh tribulation stage not create a world themselves? Why would they pay the price in exchange for the right to enter the continent of the tower? It was precisely because he knew how difficult it was for a cultivator to become a tribulation-entering powerhouse that Luo Fan had never expected that the island he built and the island branches he would divide would have the foundation to allow a cultivator to become a tribulation-entering powerhouse. Therefore, one could imagine how incredible it was for the ruler of the dynasty to achieve a breakthrough. It was almost like creating a possibility from the impossible. After all, Luo Fan was the creator of these islands and the branch islands. His control over these two things was not comparable to other existences. Previously, he had never thought that these island branches could allow cultivators to become tribulation stage experts, so he did not know how to achieve this goal. However, at that moment, as the dynasty's ruler demonstrated the breakthrough process, he completely understood what was going on. He was even more clear about the key to the breakthrough. Is the key to communication. Just simplifying it is enough to make the impossible possible. How many benefits can the communication between these islands and the sea of nothingness bring? An inexplicable expectation surged from the bottom of his heart. The reason why the ruler of the dynasty was able to break through was that after he had transcended the world with his dynasty, his body and mind were integrated into the huge world that existed between the dynasty and the many island branches. This kind of communication was obviously limited to the many worlds within the many island branches. Although it was quite mysterious and contained endless principles, in essence, it was equivalent to a simplified communication between the island branches and the boundless sea of nothingness outside. The communication between these island branches and the sea of nothingness was equivalent to communication with the sixth layer of the Tao Master Path. What was the scale of the Tao Master Path? It was a layer that contained countless layers of the sea of nothingness and also the infinite heavens. Even the island itself was like a drop of water in the sea when compared to the entire sea of nothingness. In this way, the scale of the communication between the island and the sea of nothingness was naturally countless times greater than the communication between the many worlds within the island. To say that the communication between the many worlds within the island branches was a simplification of the communication between the island and the sea of nothingness, from a certain point of view, it could almost be regarded as elevating the island now. The communication between the many worlds within the island branches alone was enough to make the impossible possible. It allowed a peak supreme emperor to break through the limit and become an expert in the tribulation realm. How could Luo Fan not have endless expectations for the communication between the island and the sea of nothingness? However, although the communication between the many worlds within the island was a simplification of the communication between the island and the sea of nothingness, the simplification also had its advantages. Because it was a simplification, the communication obviously reduced a lot of mysteries, although this was a weakness in terms of perfection. However, from an understanding point of view, this made it much easier to absorb the mysteries contained in this kind of exchange. Although the communication between the island and the sea of nothingness was perfect, and although the mysteries contained were rich and could even be considered perfect, it was precisely because it was too rich and perfect that it made it unimaginably difficult to understand these mysteries. As a result, Luo Fan, who could constantly feel the indescribable great tribulation communication between the island and the sea of nothingness, could not even describe the specific benefits he gained from this communication. On the other hand, the ruler of the dynasty easily relied on the communication between the many worlds within the island branches to break through the bottleneck and obtain a fundamental improvement in his cultivation realm. If I can build some steps between these two kinds of communication, perhaps I can seamlessly connect the two. By then, it might be enough to raise living beings to the level of a sixth tribulation expert. Thinking of the difference between the two levels of communication, an idea flashed through Luo Fan's mind. If he could really build those steps, It obviously did not matter to Luo Fan how many benefits the cultivators within the many island branches would gain, because at that time, Luo Fan himself could also use such steps to understand the communication between the many island branches and the sea of nothingness at this time. If he could understand this kind of communication more easily, naturally he would be able to understand the communication between his heavens and the sea of nothingness more easily. Once he achieved this step, he was obviously only one step away from completely understanding the mysteries that existed in the 6th level of the road to Tao Master and the cultivation of a 6th tribulation expert needed. Thinking of this possibility, Luo Fan could not help but feel excited that he had not felt for a long time. I must build enough steps, he said to himself in his heart. In an instant, he paid more attention to the situation within the island branches. His original indifferent mentality was instantly dispelled. With the ruler of the dynasty turning the impossible into the possible, his view of the many cultivators within the many island branches also changed. Originally, he only regarded these cultivators as nobodies and did not think that they would be of any help to him. That was why it was so easy to let those cultivators who had transcended directly transcend the island and the many island branches. Now, after seeing the achievements of the ruler of the dynasty, he understood that he might have underestimated those cultivators before. The potential of those cultivators might be more powerful than he had imagined. Their use to him might not only be to perfect the world within the island branches. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. At this moment, the ruler of the dynasty in a certain island branch trembled slightly. He suddenly felt that the communication between the dynasty and the countless other worlds seemed to suddenly become much clearer. It was as if the fog that originally existed between this kind of communication had suddenly disappeared completely. What's going on? At this moment, the ruler of the dynasty could not help but feel a little surprised and uncertain. As this kind of communication became clearer, the volume of the communication naturally began to increase greatly. A huge amount of information was transmitted from the dynasty and flowed into countless worlds. At the same time, there was also an endless amount of information flowing into the dynasty's world from the unknown worlds. It then rapidly flowed into the ruler's heart through the connection between the dynasty's ruler and the dynasty's world. In just an instant, an inexplicable feeling of fullness appeared in the ruler's heart, causing him to suddenly feel that his mind had become sluggish. However, at this moment, this kind of communication was still going on continuously. The endless information was still continuously flowing into the dynasty's world through that kind of communication. It then continuously flowed into his heart through the connection between the dynasty's world and the dynasty's world. A feeling like his body was about to explode gradually appeared in his heart, and it became more and more intense as time passed. It gradually made him feel that he would rather be dead than alive. I can't continue like this. The thought appeared in the ruler's heart. In the beginning, he was extremely happy when he felt the massive amount of information that was countless times more than before entering his heart. After all, this might allow him to comprehend more mysteries that he could not comprehend before, and he would learn more information that he did not know before. However, as the amount of information increased, his joy was gradually washed away. In the end, there was only panic left. It was the panic that his body and mind were about to explode. Chapter 31:21. The moment that thought flashed through the dynasty's ruler's mind, his body instantly exploded. That's right, there was no turning point. The dynasty's ruler did not have the time to use any method to change his predicament before he exploded from the endless information. At that moment, the world of the dynasty shook violently. Every living being in the world sensed their hearts go blank at the same time, as if something important to them had suddenly disappeared. An indescribable sorrow gradually emerged from the depths of their hearts. Most of the living beings did not know what this meant, but it was clear that there were extremely powerful cultivators in this dynasty. There were even quite a few supreme emperors among them. Ordinary living beings did not know what these strange sensations meant, but they could naturally guess many things. As a result, in an instant, an unknown number of figures appeared where the altar was. It was also the spot where the dynasty's ruler had been staying ever since the world was formed. When they arrived, they knew that their ominous premonition had come true. This was because not only had the dynasty's ruler disappeared, but the huge altar that contained 129,600 worlds and endless wondrous materials had also disappeared without a trace. There was only an extremely deep pit left where the altar used to be. Fortunately, due to the need to maintain the solemnity around the altar, there were no living beings staying there. Otherwise, with the density of living beings around the altar, the sudden change would have killed hundreds of millions of living beings. His Majesty has disappeared, a cultivator cried out at that moment. The voice spread across hundreds of millions of kilometers in the blink of an eye, stirring up panic that was many times more intense than before. The dynasty's ruler was the reason why they were able to transcend and come to this place. There is no need to mention how grateful and respectful they were towards the dynasty's ruler. That reason alone was enough for them to feel great sorrow when they heard that the dynasty's ruler had disappeared. On top of that, apart from their gratitude and respect for the dynasty's ruler had become their spiritual pillar since a long time ago, as the person who led them to transcend the world. Even though the dynasty's ruler had not taken any action for hundreds of millions of years, as if he did not exist at all and did not participate in any of their activities, as long as they thought that he was in this world, as long as they knew that he was on that altar, they would feel a strong sense of security. It was as if there was an omnipotent existence behind him. No matter what mistakes he made, no matter what drastic changes occur in the world, that omnipotent existence could calmly solve all problems. This was a sense of security. Under such circumstances, how could they not panic when the dynasty's ruler, who could bring them a sense of security, suddenly disappeared without a trace? Even if dynasty's ruler just disappeared, left them, and was unwilling to protect them anymore, it was enough to make them feel empty. And this was only the most optimistic scenario. It was more likely that the dynasty's ruler had disappeared because he encountered some sort of drastic change that he couldn't bear. If that was really the case, would that drastic change spread to them after his disappearance? Would it spread to the entire world? They became even more panicked when they thought of this. An inexplicable chaos began to gradually spread in all directions from this area. It could be predicted that if the situation did not change completely, the originally unified dynasty would probably have a split that should have happened a long time ago. After all, the Imperial Dynasty world was now a world of its own, not the Imperial Dynasty of the past. As a world, its foundation was many times more profound than that of the previous dynasties. The ruling method of the previous dynasty was actually a little unsuitable for this dynasty that had a much deeper foundation. It was only because the dynasty's ruler was suppressing everything that the unsuitable was forcefully ignored, allowing the dynasty to maintain the ruling structure of the previous dynasty. Now, with the disappearance of the dynasty's ruler, the unsuitable that was forcefully ignored naturally became more and more obvious. Even if all living beings in this world respected the dynasty's ruler, the trend of a split was absolutely unavoidable. Even if a powerful existence like the dynasty's ruler appeared in this world again, he could only form a small dynasty structure at most. It was impossible for the world to return to its previous unified state. This was the development of matter. In the next 10,000 years, the entire world seemed to have fallen into a split. Wars began to break out in various parts of the empire. Large numbers of living beings died, and large numbers of cultivators fell. In fact, the entire world showed signs of life and vitality that it had never shown before. All sorts of things that had never appeared in the world of the dynasty, or even the world before the dynasty transcended, were constantly being born in various parts of the world. For example, there were many unimaginable races that seemed to have existed for a long time, but had not been discovered in the past. They appeared everywhere in this world. For example, there were many strange resources that had never been seen before appearing in places that had seemed extremely ordinary in the past. For example, There were all sorts of things and sceneries that only existed in legends but had not been seen by any cultivators or living beings for hundreds of millions of years had once again appeared in this world, and so on and so forth. The profoundness of it could not be described with words at all. It felt as if this world had suddenly stimulated its own potential and was truly beginning to come to life. Although it had only been 10,000 years, it felt as if millions and millions of years had passed in the eyes of all living beings. All the changes that had happened in the world in the past 10,000 years might not have even happened in billions of years. Whether it was the world itself or the changes in the relationships between the living beings in the world, it was the same. 10,000 years was naturally a rather short period of time for a dynasty that had split and unified the world. However, after 10,000 years of development, the embryonic form of the split had gradually taken shape. The original dynasty had gradually split into 10 large dynasties, hundreds of small dynasties, and tens of thousands of ordinary countries. Of course, although the embryonic form had already appeared, it was clearly still extremely unstable. There were many conflicts between the many large dynasties, small dynasties, and countries. They were dissatisfied with their own territories and the resources that they occupied. Due to such conflicts and dissatisfaction, it was clear that the world would not be peaceful for a long time to come. There would definitely be some changes in the division of these forces. According to the size of the dynasty, when the situation had truly stabilized, the number of large dynasties would probably reach 17 to 18. The number of small dynasties would also increase by 10 to 20%. In comparison, the tens of thousands of ordinary countries would be reduced by 30 to 40%. Time slowly passed amidst the internal strife and chaos of the dynasty. Unknowingly, 1 billion years had already passed. Back then, it had only been 10,000 years, but the embryonic form of the split had already appeared. However, in the end, when the entire split was completed and the many large dynasties, small dynasties, and ordinary countries had truly stabilized and acknowledged each other, 1 billion years had passed. On this day, 1 billion years after the ruler of the dynasty had disappeared, the last territorial war had completely ended. The last territorial dispute had completely ended, and the entire world had finally completely stabilized. At this time, the number of large dynasties in the entire world was as expected. There were 17 of them. The number of small dynasties was not much different from the original estimate. There were a total of 437 of them. After that, the ordinary countries have been reduced to over 30,000. However, the overall trend of change was not much different from the original concern. Among these forces, the highest rulers of the large dynasties were all supreme emperors. The rulers of the small dynasties were usually people in despair. The highest rulers of the ordinary countries were at least false saints, of course. This did not mean that all supreme emperors could rule the large dynasties. All the people in despair could rule the small dynasties, and all false saints could rule the ordinary countries. In reality, the cultivators who participated in this kind of power struggle were ultimately only a small portion. However, a large portion of cultivators chose a different path and chose not to become rulers. Just like the supreme emperors, there were obviously more than 17 supreme emperors in this world. In reality, the number of supreme emperors in the entire world was probably more than 10 times the number of 17. As for people in despair and false saints, although there were not 10 times more of them, there was still a difference of several times. However, these cultivators had different thoughts. They either submitted to those rulers or cultivated in seclusion, staying away from the power in the world. Due to the war that had lasted for 1 billion years, the entire world had undergone a tremendous change. Now, even if the ruler of the dynasty returned, he would probably not be able to recognize the dynasty world that he had led the world to transcend. First of all, the range that living beings could reach was already many times wider than before. Back then, because the speed of the expansion of the dynasty world exceeded the speed of the development of living beings, although the dynasty claimed to have unified the world, the area that it really occupied was only a few tenths of the entire world. Even though the empire was constantly seeking to expand its territory, there was still a long way to go before it could truly bring all the regions in the world under its rule. However, after 1 billion years of war, although there were still some areas in the entire world that were still uninhabited and not occupied by any dynasty or any country, there was less than a tenth of the area left. More than 90% of the remaining areas had already become the territories of various empires or countries of various sizes. The breadth of this development was more than 10 times greater than before. Apart from that, the number of living beings in the dynasty did not decrease, but increased instead. It was more than 10 times greater than before. As for the number of races in the world, the types and quantity of various resources, and even the vitality of the world, the stability of time, and the stability of space, they had all improved greatly compared to before. It felt like the past 1 billion years did not seem to be chaos or war in the dynasty world, but the entire world had entered the fast lane of development. At this moment, the various changes finally began to gradually slow down after the structure of the various forces in the dynasty world had truly stabilized. Although it had not truly ended, it had already slowed to an almost negligible state. Clearly, the various changes in the world earlier were due to the stimulation of the war. Time slowly passed in such a stable state, and hundreds of millions of years passed unknowingly. On this day, at the place where the dynasty ruler had disappeared, countless streams of light suddenly gathered above the deep pit where the altar had disappeared, gradually filling up the deep pit. Although the dynasty world soon fell into a split after the dynasty ruler disappeared, in reality, the living beings that split the dynasty ruler still respected the dynasty ruler quite a lot. This was the place where the dynasty's ruler had disappeared. Even when the entire world was filled with battles, it was not affected at all. Therefore, after billions of years, this place still looked the same as it did in the past. It did not turn into ruins in a war, nor was it occupied and developed by any dynasty or country. If there was any place in this world that remained the same as it was billions of years ago, it would probably be this altar and the area around it. On this day, countless streaks of light gathered, gradually filling up the crater that seemed to have been frozen in time. Gradually, a building that had disappeared for hundreds of millions of years appeared. It was an altar constructed from 129,600 worlds and countless materials of all kinds. At that moment, an indescribable tremor began to spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it spread to every inch of space in the world. Chapter 31:22. At that instant, an indescribable heavenly sound appeared out of nowhere and echoed in the ears of all living beings in the world. In particular, the rulers of the dynasties and countries had a closer connection with the world after becoming rulers of dynasties or countries. As a result, they could hear the heavenly sound even more clearly. In the ears of ordinary living beings, these sounds could only be clearly discerned. However, in the ears of the rulers, the heavenly sound was deafening. They felt as if their minds were almost shattered. He's back. Although the shock they received was much greater than what ordinary living beings received, at the same time, they obtained information that far surpassed what ordinary living beings could obtain from the intense shock. Therefore, they discovered the reason for the heavenly sound's appearance in an extremely short period of time. At that moment, the many rulers were both surprised and delighted. They naturally respected and felt gratitude towards the dynasty's ruler. After all, they had relied on the dynasty's ruler to reach their current realm. They had also relied on the dynasty's ruler to build a foundation for what they had today. The feeling made them happy that the dynasty's ruler had reappeared in the world. However, at the same time, they were filled with fear towards the dynasty's ruler due to their previous split. How would the dynasty's ruler view them? Would he think that they had stabilized the world after he left? Or would he think that they had betrayed him? Or would he think that they were heartless and ungrateful? As soon as they thought that the dynasty's ruler might think that they had betrayed him, fear gushed out of their hearts uncontrollably. Even though they had achievements that they dared not imagine in the past and obtained abilities that they could not compare to in the past, they still did not have the confidence to compare to the dynasty's ruler. Judging from the abilities that the dynasty's ruler had displayed, even before he had transcended with the entire dynasty, he had been far more powerful than they were now. At the very least, back then, the dynasty's ruler had been able to maintain his dynasty almost eternally under the covetous gazes of many other dynasties' rulers. Meanwhile, they could only divide the dynasty's ruler with the other rulers. That was only the situation before the dynasty's ruler had transcended with the dynasty. After transcending with the dynasty, they were able to reap such great benefits and achieve great breakthroughs in cultivation realms. They did not believe that the dynasty's ruler had not reaped any benefits at all. Even before they obtained the benefits, they could easily crush them now. Just thinking about how much of an advantage they would have after obtaining the benefits, many of the rulers felt their hair stand on end. Perhaps I should make a decision. Countless rulers had already made their decision. Immediately, strands of transcendence light appeared throughout the world, and they appeared around the rulers of the various grand dynasties, minor dynasties, and kingdoms. Following the transcendence light, the rulers' figures gradually disappeared into the void. In the end, when the heavenly voice disappeared, their figures had completely disappeared. There was no longer any trace of them in this world. It was obvious that these rulers had a guilty conscience, but they didn't even dare to meet the ruler of the empire. When they sensed the ruler of the empire's appearance, they chose to transcend and leave this world. Of course, the rulers who made this choice were only a small portion of the many rulers. But not all rulers made the same choice. There were still some rulers who either thought that the dynasty's ruler would not do anything to them, or felt that they had a clear conscience, or wanted to bear the consequences of their actions. In short, they did not choose to run away. Instead, they stayed where they were and quietly waited for things to develop. At that moment, the dynasty's ruler's figure appeared on the altar that had completely taken shape. However, although his figure had appeared, he still seemed as if he did not exist. There was no aura being emitted at all. It felt like his figure was just an ordinary shadow in the world, like a natural landscape that existed in nature. At a glance, one would only think that he was a part of nature, a part of the world. His gaze was unimaginably deep at that moment, as if the entire world was contained in his eyes. Previously, when his body exploded from the boundless information, his mind was completely immersed in the boundless information, enduring the endless cleansing of the boundless information that came from an unknown number of heavens and earth. In this cleansing process, he felt as if he had fallen into an endless cycle of reincarnation. He was reincarnated in one bizarre and dazzling world after another. He experienced life after life and saw one world after another, or in other words, heaven and earth. In those cycles of reincarnation, he was like a bystander. Although he could experience all of this personally, he could not control the body he was in, nor could he affect what the body experienced in the slightest. Life after life, world after world, reincarnation after reincarnation. By the time his condition completely stabilized, he had already gone through an unknown number of trillions of reincarnations and experienced an unknown number of trillions of worlds or worlds. These cycles of reincarnation had left an incomparably deep mark on his ego. Although he was a tribulation initiation powerhouse, and his mind was extremely firm, the reincarnation did not completely distort his self-awareness. However, it still made him undergo a rather obvious change. For example, compared to before, he now had a feeling that he could see through everything. At this moment, the rulers who had not attempted to transcend finally realized what had happened. They were both horrified and relieved. From the looks of it just now, it was clear that after the ruler of the dynasty appeared, he directly made a move to forcefully capture those rulers who had already transcended and left this world. Although it had only been 1 or 2 breaths' time between the ruler's disappearance and the ruler of the dynasty capturing them. Although the ruler of the dynasty had many thoughts after escaping, it had only taken 1 or 2 breaths' time. However, no matter what, they had already transcended and left this world. Under such circumstances, they obviously shouldn't be affected by this world. After all, what was the point of transcending if one could still be affected by the power of this world after transcending? Transcendence was to get rid of all shackles and influences. However, even under such circumstances, they were still captured by the ruler of the empire, and they were like little chicks. How could they not be fearful of the ruler of the empire? There is no need to mention the relief they felt. They cannot escape at all. Instead, they would be caught and punished even more. In that case, if they chose not to escape, they would obviously be spared from being punished even more. Of course, this was something worth rejoicing over. At the very least, compared to those who had escaped and were captured again, this was something worth rejoicing over. Hurry up and get over here, the dynasty's ruler said coldly. This sentence directly spread to the ears of all the rulers in this world, making them feel as if they were being watched by a huge monster. It was as if their bodies and minds were going to be completely erased in the next moment. At this moment, be it the rulers of the great dynasty, the rulers of the small dynasty, or the rulers of the ordinary countries, they did not dare to delay at all. They used their fastest means and rushed towards the location of the ruler of the dynasty. In the blink of an eye, there were already many cultivators above the false sage stage around the altar. These cultivators were surrounding the altar at this moment, and all of them looked extremely nervous. Greetings, Your Majesty. Congratulations on returning from the tribulation. At this moment, a ruler of the great dynasty directly prostrated himself to the ruler of the dynasty and shouted. Following his action, the other rulers seemed to have woken up from a dream. One by one, they bowed to the ruler of the dynasty above the altar and shouted, "Greetings, Your Majesty. Congratulations on returning from the tribulation." Their voices were earth-shattering. There were only tens of thousands of people, but they shouted with the momentum of billions of people. As rulers, these cultivators had long become one with their own countries, small dynasty and large dynasty. Their wholehearted worship naturally had all kinds of feedback to the area they ruled. This feedback made all living beings in this world suddenly feel as if they were worshiping an extremely terrifying existence at this moment, making them feel a sense of awe from the bottom of their hearts. So, you guys still remember me. The ruler of the dynasty only said indifferently at this moment. With this sentence, an earth-shattering pressure suddenly acted on the surrounding cultivators, causing them to suddenly feel that their bodies and minds were being restrained by some kind of terrifying power. Strange cracking sounds kept coming from their bodies. Their strength, abilities seemed to have completely disappeared at this moment. They could no longer sense anything at all. They could only rely on their bodies to resist the incredible pressure coming from all directions. At this moment, the many rulers heaved a sigh of relief. Although the ruler of the dynasty seemed to be very angry at this moment, at least he did not directly erase all of them. This was obviously good news. It meant that their chances of survival might not be as small as they had imagined. "Please forgive us, Your Majesty." At this moment, the many rulers could only beg for mercy obediently. As for quibbling that they had not done anything wrong previously and that everything they had done was a performance of loyalty, that was simply treating the ruler of the dynasty as a fool. It was easy to say that they were courting death. Chapter 31:23. At that moment, the dynasty's ruler was still extremely furious. Looking at the cultivators around him, who didn't seem to have changed at all from billions of years ago, and were still as obedient and loyal as before, and thinking of what they had done in the billions of years since he left, he couldn't help but want to erase all of them. However, as a tribulation stage powerhouse, his rationality would not be blinded by his emotions. Although he was extremely furious because of the actions of the many powerhouses, he knew that wiping them out was just a temporary event. It would not help his interests at all, and it would even cause great harm to him. The reason for this was very simple. It was because his relationship with the world had undergone a fundamental change after watching countless reincarnations over the billions of years. Back then, he could barely be considered the heaven's way of the world. However, he had now truly become the heaven's way of the world. In fact, he had even vaguely surpassed the heaven's way. To him, He could now directly obtain everything that he could obtain from the dynasty from the world. Under such circumstances, the more powerful this world was, the more benefits it would bring him. The more damaged the world was, the less benefits he would obtain. Under such circumstances, this world had been divided into so many big empires, small empires, and countries. Compared to the previous world that was still under his command, there seemed to be no essential difference. The benefits that he should have received were not reduced at all. In comparison, although it would feel good for the time being if he wiped out those rulers, it would cause the entire world to fall into chaos in the end. In the end, there would be great internal friction in the world, and the benefits that he could obtain in the world would be greatly reduced. It was precisely because of this that it was clearly not a wise choice to wipe them out. However, although he knew logically that the existence of those rulers was more beneficial to him, it did not make him feel completely at ease. The frustration of everything that he had worked so hard to build was destroyed by his loyal subordinates after he left for a short, while made him unable to suppress the anger in his heart. You can avoid death, but you can't escape punishment. In the end, the dynasty's ruler decided to vent a portion of his anger before doing anything else. At that moment, his heart moved, and the world around him began to tremble. Immediately afterward, balls of light that represented reincarnation appeared on the many rulers who were prostrating themselves to him. When this light first appeared, it was extremely weak and dim. If one was not careful, they might even ignore it. However, as time passed, it became so intense that it was blinding in just a short while. It felt as if suns had appeared in the surroundings. In the face of this reincarnation light, if those rulers were determined to resist, they would be able to struggle free. After all, they were existences above the pseudo-sage stage. This kind of existence already had a certain say in front of the heavens and earth. Although the reincarnation light that came from the heavens and earth could still affect them greatly, they were not powerless ants that could not resist the reincarnation light at all. Of course, if they really resisted, their actions would definitely not be small. Even if they had a certain say in the world, it was still just a certain amount. It was already extremely rare for them to be able to struggle a little, so how could they move easily? Once they really did that, it would obviously be equivalent to completely falling out with the dynasty's ruler. What do you mean? Don't you know that thunder and rain are the king's grace? Me punishing you is also a form of grace to you. How dare you resist? Are you not acknowledging me as your king? Obviously, looking at how these rulers were obediently prostrating themselves on the ground and worshiping the dynasty's ruler, it was obvious that they did not have the confidence to completely fall out with the dynasty's ruler. Therefore, in the face of this reincarnation light, although they could barely resist, they did not make up their mind to resist in the end. Of course, this was also because they had figured out the effects of this reincarnation light. This reincarnation light could definitely make ordinary living beings fall completely, and it was even enough to make them unable to reincarnate forever. However, to cultivators like them who were at least at the false saint stage, it was only equivalent to imprisonment. Even if they reincarnated thousands of times, they would be able to recover in an instant when they finally found an opportunity, completely treating the thousands of reincarnations from before as a dream. Therefore, although this reincarnation light would eventually make them feel rather uncomfortable, it would not cause too much damage to them. It was precisely because they recognized this that they chose to accept it and not fall out with it. If it was not this reincarnation light, but another method that wanted to wipe them out and cause irreparable damage to them, they would definitely not accept it so obediently. Whether they could resist it or not was secondary, but it was inevitable for them to resist. After all, if they did not resist, the consequences would be unbearable for them. In comparison, although there was a high chance that they would fail to resist, there was still some hope of success. At this moment, the many rulers gradually turned into nothingness as they were enveloped by the reincarnation light. From the depths of the world, endless strange rules started to gather at this spot, gradually turning into an indescribable river that enveloped the many rulers within the reincarnation light. By the time the river flowed past, the many rulers had completely disappeared. The surroundings had become empty once again. In the eyes of the dynasty's rulers, the river had directly brought the many rulers into the rules and laws layer, completely splitting them up. Their powers were completely suppressed, their cultivation levels were completely suppressed, and even a large portion of their memories were blocked. In the end, it looked like there was only a subtle spiritual light that flowed into the depths of the world. In the end, it entered the stomachs of living beings and began to be reborn amidst countless indescribable and complicated changes. Of course, there were naturally differences in this kind of rebirth. The living beings that waited for their summons obediently and did not attempt to leave would usually choose a better mother. It was not just a matter of identity, but also a difference in race. In comparison, the rulers that chose to transcend and leave the world after sensing the dynasty's ruler's reappearance were different. In the end, they were captured by the dynasty's ruler. Among them, the best had been directly reincarnated into primates like monkeys. The worst even turned into bacteria or plankton. In short, not a single one of them was an intelligent living being in the world. Seeing the many rulers enter the reincarnation obediently and begin to enjoy the various fates that he had arranged for them, the dynasty's ruler finally felt his anger subside slightly. Afterward, he said, "All reincarnate for 10,000 lifetimes. Those that are not reincarnated for 10,000 lifetimes will not be able to transcend." Although the words came out of his mouth, it was as if they came from the world itself, causing the entire world to tremble uncontrollably. As the trembling occurred, layers of shackles suddenly appeared on the many rulers that had been reborn. These shackles were densely stacked on top of each other, wrapping around them tightly. The number of shackles on each ruler was more than 10,000. Clearly, they could only get rid of one layer of shackles each time they reincarnated. Only when the 10,000 layers of shackles were completely broken could they truly break through all the shackles and transcend the misfortune of this reincarnation. With this change, the memories of the rulers that would have gradually awakened after a period of time were covered in layers of fog. The existence of this fog isolated the interaction between the memories in this body. Although these memories still existed, the difficulty of awakening them had increased by many times. However, all of this did not cause any intrinsic harm to the rulers. At the very least, it was not enough to trigger their sense of danger and make them feel that their intrinsic nature was threatened. Therefore, none of these rulers would sense anything because of the dynasty's rulers' actions. Naturally, they would not resist at all costs because of this. If that was not the case, once these rulers felt the abnormality and realized that their lives were in danger, they would definitely break free from the reincarnation shackles. Given that they were at least at the false saint level, it was actually not difficult for them to break free from the reincarnation shackles imposed by a world. This was also the reason why these rulers were willing to accept the punishment obediently. Because they had such confidence, they did not need to worry that the dynasty's ruler would suddenly change his mind in the process of punishment and directly wipe them out at this moment. Although these layers of shackles and the fog that shrouded their memories would make them suffer more and make more unimaginable mistakes, it was clearly only making them suffer and make mistakes. No matter what, it would not threaten their lives at all. Therefore, they did not sense anything at all and did not activate their trump cards to resist directly. After dealing with the many rulers, the dynasty's ruler finally completely relaxed. Although he was unhappy with the betrayal of the many rulers, in reality, after calming down, he had to admit that in reality, the current state of this world was actually more beneficial to him. At the very least, from what he had gained from the sudden increase in the communication between this world and the many other worlds, the current state of this world was more suitable for his next plan. There will definitely be many of my kind appearing next. I must first have a deeper understanding of transcendence in order to gain an advantage in communicating with them. This thought flashed through his mind. The same kind that he was thinking of was naturally the kind of existence that transcended with a part of their world. The reason why he judged that there would be many such existences appearing next was also very simple. In the process of the rapid increase in the communication between this world and the other endless worlds, although his main consciousness was integrated into the repeated reincarnations, the information that was exchanged still continuously flowed through his mind during this process. Therefore, he clearly knew what the information that was exchanged was. In reality, the information that was exchanged from the other endless worlds was all-encompassing, almost containing all the mysterious principles and mysteries of the endless worlds. Compared to the other endless worlds, the information that was exchanged from this world was much more monotonous. The information that was exchanged from this world was none other than the cultivation experience of the dynasty's ruler. Although it did not contain all the details, it contained the key points of his cultivation. For example, transcendence allowed him to break through the shackles of the world, surpass peak supreme emperors, and become a tribulation stage powerhouse. As the ruler of a dynasty, as an existence that could find a breakthrough in the impossible, the dynasty's ruler was naturally smart enough. He obviously knew what the other peak supreme emperors would choose after discovering this cultivation method. As for whether those peak supreme emperors would discover it, there was no need to even mention it. As peak supreme emperors, comprehending the world was almost instinctive. As long as there was information in the world, they would definitely have a way to obtain it. Even if not all pinnacle supreme emperors could obtain it, there were definitely pinnacle supreme emperors who could obtain such information. Therefore, when this information was communicated to the various heavens and earths, it also meant that the pinnacle sovereigns were aware of it. Because of these various deductions, he was certain that peak supreme emperors who had transcended with a part of their world would definitely appear endlessly from the start of this communication. Even though there might be a large number of peak supreme emperors who failed to transcend, there would definitely be a lot of them who succeeded. Naturally, this did not change the fact that the number of existences that he recognized as his kind would keep increasing. The reason why the dynasty's ruler looked forward to the appearance of his kind was even more simple. It was because he also needed more of his kind to help him explore how to break through to a higher realm. Chapter 31-24. After experiencing being imprisoned in a certain realm once, the dynasty's ruler did not want to experience it a second time. Previously, when he was at the peak stage, Supreme Emperor stage, he had been imprisoned for trillions of years. In the end, he relied on the dynasty to transcend the world and finally broke through this layer of imprisonment with great difficulty, becoming a tribulation stage powerhouse. Under such circumstances, facing the situation where he could not find a way out, it went without saying how strong his desire to break through this imprisonment was. However, it had been hundreds of millions of years since he became a tribulation stage powerhouse. Although it was much shorter than the time he had spent at the peak of the Supreme Emperor stage, it was definitely not a short time. During this period of time, he obtained countless opportunities, and his cultivation realm rose steadily. However, in the end, no matter how profound the mysteries he came into contact with, he stopped at the tribulation stage powerhouse level. There were no signs of him surpassing the tribulation stage powerhouse at all. This obviously meant that if he continued to develop according to his current opportunities, he might be able to reach the peak of the tribulation stage powerhouse at an unimaginable speed. However, in the end, it was very likely that he would be imprisoned at the peak of the tribulation stage powerhouse, just like how he was imprisoned at the peak stage Supreme Emperor stage back then, unable to break through for countless trillions of years. Relying on the same opportunities could not change his fate of being imprisoned at this realm. Obviously, the only thing he could do was change. Now, the change that the dynasty's ruler wanted to do was to find more of his kind, more tribulation stage powerhouses, and gather their wisdom to explore a higher realm together. Naturally, it was an extremely difficult thing to explore a higher realm with many existences of the same level. The chances of success were not very high. However, no matter how small the chances of success were, it was not zero. Since it was not zero, there was naturally hope. It was precisely because of this that the dynasty's ruler had such a plan at this time. After sending the rulers of the dynasties, and ordinary countries into reincarnation, The many forces in this world did not change much. Those rulers were not the rulers of the secular world after all. The weakest among them was also a false saint. Naturally, such existences would not be as friendly to their own forces as mortals were to their own forces. Therefore, the way they ruled their own forces was actually more similar to the way the ruler of a dynasty ruled his own dynasty. In other words, it was almost like a hands-off ruling style. Under such a ruling method, even if they lived for a period of time, it would not affect their rule much. Of course, the prerequisite was that they weren't like the rulers of the empires who lived for hundreds of millions of years or billions of years. Therefore, even though the rulers had been sent into reincarnation, the scenery in the world was still the same as before. It was still as stable as before. The dynasty's ruler took a rough look at the situation in this part of the world, and then focused his attention on the many reincarnated rulers. Of course, this was not to strengthen their punishment, but to guide them onto the path of transcendence. The focus of their attention was naturally on those supreme Emperor Realm existences. Compared to other cultivators, these supreme Emperor Realm existences were the closest to his current realm. In this way, it would be much easier for them to break through to his current realm than other powerhouses, and the time they could provide him with help would also be much shorter. As for guiding those rulers to transcend, it sounded very troublesome, but in reality, it was not difficult to do. All he needed to do was to work hard to let these rulers establish more and stronger bonds with the things they wanted to remove. As long as there were enough bonds, and they were strong enough, they would naturally be more reluctant to give up on these things. The decision to give up on these things to transcend would be more difficult. In this way, the bonds would be strengthened again and again. In the end, these bonds would eventually push these powerhouses to make the decision to transcend with everything they cared about. In his estimation, if he handled it well, 10,000 reincarnations would obviously be enough to completely change their minds. Because of this, he had directly set these rulers to undergo 10,000 reincarnations. When the ruler of the imperial dynasty began to work hard to help his subordinates who had betrayed him increase the bonds with the things around them and strengthen the bonds, many cultivators in the other island branches began to take action, taking a part of the world to transcend and transform into a new world could give oneself a chance to break through. This information had long been analyzed by them from the world, although they did not know whether this information was true or false, and what the probability of success was. For those cultivators who were imprisoned at the peak of the supreme Emperor realm, the existence of this news was enough to make them extremely excited. After all, this was the hope of breaking through that they had been looking for hundreds of millions of years. Even if it was only 1% or even 1%, it was enough for them to invest all their energy to verify it. Although the flow of time in many worlds was not the same, the general difference was quite limited. At the very least, the flow of time was far faster than the 6th level of the Down Master Road outside the island branches. Therefore, at this time, billions of years had passed in the Imperial Dynasty world, and the time spent in other worlds was almost the same. The reason why it took such a long time for cultivators to begin to transcend was actually very simple, because the risk of transcending the entire world was too great. The risk was so great that even if they knew, they would not do it unless they had no other choice. It was precisely because of this that only after billions of years had passed did a cultivator from a certain world attempt to transcend with a region of the world he cared about. In a certain world, in a certain island branch, an altar that was quite similar to the altar built by the ruler of the Imperial Dynasty appeared in a corner of this world. This was the first attempt, so naturally, they had to follow the experience of their predecessors. If they wanted to innovate and improve, they had to confirm that the experience was real and that the final result was achievable before they could proceed. Obviously, the information that transcended the world could obtain a breakthrough came from the ruler of the Imperial Dynasty, which meant that the only reference for this kind of experience was what the ruler of the Imperial Dynasty had done. Therefore, all kinds of preparations and all kinds of construction were like what the ruler of the Imperial Dynasty had done. On this altar, there was a peak-level sovereign realm cultivator. This peak supreme emperor was the sect master of a sect, as well as the founder of this sect. He had ruled over this sect for trillions of years. In these trillions of years, this sect had developed from non-existence until it became the largest sect in this world. It occupied almost 30% of this world's territory and obtained more than 50% of this world's resources. As for the disciples in the sect, they were counted in trillions. Such a huge sect, no matter where it was placed, could definitely be called a colossus. The entire process of this sect's development had appeared under the control of this peak supreme emperor. It could be said that every bit of the sect's growth and progress was soaked in a lot of the peak supreme emperor's blood and sweat. It was precisely because of this that the peak supreme emperor had extremely deep feelings for the sect he had established. It was precisely because of such deep feelings that even though he already had the ability to transcend and leave this world a long time ago, he still did not transcend this world. Instead, he remained in this world, doing things that other peak supreme emperors found very tasteless. Under such circumstances, he had obtained the information about transcending the world from the depths of this world, and it had been like he had obtained a priceless treasure. He had spent a lot of time carefully researching the feasibility of this method, researching the advantages and disadvantages of this method, and even more carefully researching how to prepare for using this method and how to do it. Because it was related to the sect that he cared about, he spent billions of years researching all the possible outcomes and set up corresponding countermeasures. At this point, he had believed that he was confident. Even if he failed to transcend, he could still paralyze himself and his own sect. This was why he had begun to act now. Compared to the dynasty's ruler, the sect's ruler didn't hide the fact that he was going to lead the entire world to transcend. Instead, he told them his thoughts a long time ago, letting them decide for themselves whether they wanted to transcend with him or leave with him. In the end, naturally, most of them would transcend with him. However, it was clear that there were trillions of living beings, so it was impossible for all of them to be of one mind. Since the vast majority of them transcended with him, there was naturally a small portion of them that remained in this world. Of course, this small portion was only relative to the sect itself. From an objective point of view, even this small group of living beings was a terrifying number that could be calculated in trillions. The sect's ruler was naturally quite disappointed by the disciples' departure. However, it was obvious that he could only let them leave even if it was just to disturb the disciples that had decided to transcend with him. In the end, the number of living beings within the sect's territory suddenly decreased by a small half. Although the number of living beings within this territory was still unimaginably high, it could not conceal the indescribable desolation within. However, as the living beings left, the hearts of the people within the sect's territory became even more united and pure. As the hearts of the people became more united and pure, the power that the altar could obtain from the sect's territory would decrease slightly, but it would also become many times purer. In terms of overall might, it would become much stronger. During the past few days, the sovereign of the sect stood on the altar, his mind fused with the altar. He used it to spread his will throughout the entire sect, gradually forming a resonance with all the living beings in the area. He did his best to fuse the entire area into a whole. Compared to the dynasty's ruler, who had no experience at all, it was much more difficult for the sect's ruler to achieve what the dynasty's ruler had done. This was not because the founder and the successor were different, but because sects and dynasties were fundamentally different existences. The altar, as well as the other arrangements, were all set up for the dynasty. Under such circumstances, the sect's ruler naturally would not be able to adapt to the environment if he copied all these arrangements. Although the adaptation was not to the extent that the arrangements would not work, the sect's ruler would need to spend more time and effort to achieve the same result as the dynasty's ruler. As such, from a moment he started trying until he completed everything and fused all the regions within the sect's territory into an inseparable whole, close to 30,000 years had passed. Of course, from the moment the altar started working, everything within the sect's territory had already started resonating with the altar. Although the resonance was not enough for the altar to fuse everything within the sect's territory into one, it was enough to stop the sect state at the very least. What did it mean by stopping the sect state? Stopping the sect state meant that the things within the sect that would have died over time were preserved. For example, the living beings that could achieve immortality, the flowers that should have withered in a few days, the things that would deteriorate soon, and so on. All of this was fixed because the area within the sect's territory resonated with the altar. It was precisely because of this that even after 30,000 years, the area within the sect's territory was not much different from before. There were still so many living beings working hard to fuse with the altar and the sect's ruler. After close to 30,000 years, all of the preparations were finally completed. On this day, the light of transcendence gradually shone from the altar, and in the blink of an eye, it spread to every region of the sect, covering an area that spanned hundreds of millions of light years. After everything was covered, the world began to change. Ghostly wails and wolf howls appeared everywhere, drilling into the ears of all living beings. Chapter 31:25. After a calamity that lasted for dozens of years and caused the sect to lose most of its territory, the sect's rulers still managed to transcend with the rest of the sect's territory, leaving this part of the world. However, compared to his initial complacency after transcending, he felt a bit of regret in his heart. He regretted that he had chosen to transcend the world. He regretted that his arrogance had caused a large part of the territory of his sect to be completely wiped out. He regretted that more than half of the disciples in his sect had died because of him. At the same time, the powerhouses who were watching knew that transcending with the world was not as simple as treating others to a meal. Transcending with the world required an extremely shocking risk. For a time, the trend of transcending with the world that had gradually become a trend was slightly thwarted. Of course, this was only a slight setback. It was more to calm down the originally restless atmosphere. From a certain point of view, this was actually a good thing for the many cultivators in this world. The transcendence passage that the sect master had entered after transcending was also a passage that did not have a choice. Instead, it was a passage that led to the void below the island. Thus, the sect master did not need to choose at all. He brought the remaining territory of his sect and slowly moved toward the end of the passage. The amount of transcending with the world was clearly countless times greater than the amount of transcendence a cultivator could achieve alone. Thus, the speed at which he advanced in the transcendence passage was naturally much slower than the speed at which ordinary cultivators transcended. However, this was actually not a bad thing. In the transcendence passage, due to the special environment, the remaining territory of the sect did not need to endure any pressure from the outside world, nor did it need to communicate with the outside world. The entire dilapidated sect seemed to be the only existence. Even though it was extremely dilapidated, it would not completely collapse because of this dilapidation. It was as if it was fixed in this state. Because of this, the longer one stayed in the passage, the more time one could use to repair the sect. The sect master was already very clear about this from the information he had obtained from the world. Naturally, he would not waste this opportunity at all. In the ascension tunnel, he used the fastest speed to get rid of the regret he felt for bringing disaster to his own sect and his disciples. He poured all of his energy into helping this broken sect to rebuild itself. Power surged and power was released. Auras fluctuated, spells flew everywhere, and the fluctuations of techniques spread to every inch of the dilapidated sect in the Transcendence Passage. The altar also began to revolve rapidly during this process. All sorts of incredible lights were continuously released toward the dilapidated sect. Under the effects of these various methods, the dilapidated sect began to change rapidly. The power, laws, time, and space of the entire sect began to gradually recover during this process. The broken parts were quickly repaired, and the broken laws were reconnected. All kinds of lost power were quickly replenished, and all kinds of traces of tribulations were quickly eliminated. After an unknown period of time, When the Transcendence passage gradually came to an end, the dilapidated sect was swept clean. The entire dilapidated sect had become a small world. A small world like the dynasty's small world. An indescribable feeling of perfection began to spread out from this small world. It gradually fused with the transcendent feeling, causing the speed of moving through the Transcendence passage to become faster. Although a large portion of the sect had been lost in the calamity, the size of the sect itself was just too huge. Despite losing a large portion of the sect, the remaining portion was still unimaginably huge. One would need to calculate its surface area in billions of light years. If such a small world was placed somewhere else, it would not be inappropriate to call a world. A soft sound rang out at some point in time. This small world had already charged out of the Transcendence passage and appeared in a void. As it appeared, all sorts of indescribable existences began to appear out of thin air and enter this small world. There was also some sort of indescribable existence in this small world that leaked out and entered the surrounding void. A subtle communication instantly appeared between the small world of the sect and the surrounding void, or rather, between the surrounding branches of the island. As they conversed, the feeling of perfection in the small world of the sect became more and more intense, more and more obvious. All sorts of small worlds disappeared, and the true existence of the world began to gradually form in this small world. For example, the mysteries, the great laws, the laws that the world needed to be perfected, the various energies that the world needed to possess, and so on and so forth. The small world would change to a brand new appearance almost every single moment. Just like that, after who knew how much time had passed, the small world had completely turned into a true world, a world of a sect. The great laws had completely formed in this world. The stability of time and space had also reached the requirements of a normal world. As for the various other factors, they had also been perfected, and the great laws had completely met the requirements of the world. Seeing that the entire world had expanded by nearly 10 times and sensing that his authority in the world had been raised to an unprecedented level, the sect ruler revealed a faint smile. After such a long period of relaxation, he had clearly completely broken free from the regret of bringing disaster to his sect and disciples. Now, he was in a mood to enjoy the benefits of transcending the world had brought him. As he sensed deeper, he discovered that the bottleneck that had been holding him back and preventing him from breaking through had completely disappeared. It felt like he only needed a slight thought to break through his current realm and step into a completely new realm that far surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm, a realm that was known as the entering tribulation realm. As expected, transcending the world is the way to break through. At that moment, this thought appeared in his mind. Immediately afterwards, with a slight thought, his cultivation realm broke through the limit and crossed the shackles of the Supreme Emperor realm, directly entering the entering tribulation realm. The moment he became an entering tribulation realm powerhouse, an unprecedented feeling of carefreeness surged in his heart. At the same time, he could clearly sense the miraculous process of the sect's world communicating with the various worlds. At every moment, there seemed to be endless information flowing through his mind. As expected, I was just a frog at the bottom of a well. It turns out that there are so many worlds beyond this world. As he thought that, he began to carefully distinguish the auras of the worlds that were constantly communicating with the sect's world. Just like how the ruler of a dynasty wanted to find his own kind, the sect ruler also wanted to find his own kind. Very soon, he gradually locked onto a part of the world in the endless world. This part of the world was quite unfamiliar to him in all aspects. In other words, even if he searched through his memories, he would not be able to find anything familiar in that world. But even so, he still felt an indescribable sense of familiarity in this world. It was as if this part of the world was closer to him than the other endless worlds. The sect ruler was an existence that could reach the peak of the world, so how could his mind be slow? Sensing the inexplicable sense of familiarity in this part of the world, he naturally guessed what this sense of familiarity was about. My kind, Only his kind could give him such a sense of familiarity. Only his kind could give him a sense of familiarity in a situation where all the details were extremely unfamiliar. Facing this situation, an inexplicable sense of anticipation instantly surged in the sect ruler's heart. Looks like my kind has appeared. At this moment, a message suddenly appeared from the endless amount of information that flowed through his mind. Even though the information that flowed through his mind was endless, like a never-ending river, it could not cover up this message, or rather, this sentence. That's my own kind talking to me. Sensing this information, the sect's ruler immediately understood. After coming to a realization, he could not help but feel a slight chill in his heart. A feeling like his own safety could no longer be guaranteed appeared in the depths of his heart. He even began to slightly regret leading his sect to transcend so hastily. At this moment, the owner of the message seemed to know his dilemma and spoke again. Don't worry, we're separated by who knows how much time and space. Even though we can communicate from afar, I definitely cannot send any power, or ability to you. At this moment, the sect ruler did not know if he was mistaken, but he seemed to feel the part of the world he had locked on a tremble strangely. Fellow Taoist, please excuse me. At this moment, the sect ruler tried to send this message into the river of communication. After a while, he finally received a reply. However, this time, the reply was not an answer to his question, nor was it an in-depth communication with him. Instead, it was a long-distance communication method that was directly taught to him. It was very clear that when the sect ruler sent the message into the river of communication, the message did not successfully reach where the other party was. At the very least, it did not successfully reach where the other party was. When he saw this message, the sect ruler could not help but feel slightly ashamed. However, he naturally could not trust the other party so easily. After receiving this long-distance communication method, he did not directly use it to contact the other party. Instead, he began to carefully analyze this method in his mind, researching any possibilities of this method. After all, he didn't even communicate with the other party through voice, let alone meet them. How could he so easily believe that the other party didn't have any ill intentions just based on a few exchanges of information? How could he so easily believe that the other party didn't have any traps in the technique that the other party gave him? After who knew how many tens of thousands of times, he finally completely understood the fundamental principles of this method and confirmed that there were no traps. Only at this step did he sigh in relief. Even so, he did not just use this method. Instead, he used his cultivation realm that he had already broken through to create a similar method according to the principles. Clearly, even if he completely analyzed the method and understood its true principles, he could not guarantee that there were no traps or hidden dangers in the method. After all, the other party's strength was much greater than the sect ruler's. For such a powerful existence, it wouldn't be surprising at all if he had some special methods to avoid being detected by him and set up some traps. In comparison, if he used this principle to create a method to contact the other party, the possibility of the other party setting up a trap would be reduced to the minimum. If he still could not completely eliminate the trap the other party had set up, then no matter how much he resisted, it would be futile. He might as well accept it obediently. As the sect ruler who had created a peak sect, creating a method based on principles was not difficult at all for him. If he did not have this ability, how could the sect he created have so many methods and so many inheritances? Therefore, in the span of a few breaths, he had created this technique. Moreover, even though he had just created it, it was several times more perfect than the techniques passed down to him by those of the same race. It felt like the latter was a half-finished product, while the one he created was the complete product. After creating the technique, the sect's ruler carefully tested it hundreds of thousands of times. After a few breaths of time, he finally began to use the technique he had just created. As he used the method, an illusory connection extended from the sect's world to the depths of the endless world. It extended to the world that he believed had his peers there. He really is many times more powerful than I am. When the illusory connection began to spread, the sect's ruler was able to confirm his previous guess. The reason for this was none other than because the process of spreading out this illusory connection was countless times more difficult than he'd imagined it would be. Chapter 31:26. As the illusory connection traveled between the lawless lands, the sect's sovereign felt as if his mind was piercing through different parts of the world, passing through one strange, indescribable state after another. With every step he took, he felt as if there were countless channels connected to his body, furiously draining his power, might, and many other factors that made him extraordinary. If it wasn't for the fact that he was already self-sufficient and could create everything he needed at every moment, so that no matter how much he lost from various factors, he could instantly replenish all of it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to maintain this illusory connection to continue moving towards his target. However, although his self-sufficient nature allowed him to quickly replenish everything he lost, it was impossible to avoid the negative feelings that came with this process. Although the sect ruler could not say that he was in pain as if he was being dismembered, the feeling in his body definitely had nothing to do with relaxation. At this moment, although the sect ruler did not feel as if he was being cut by 1,000 cuts, the feeling in his body was definitely not the slightest bit related to relaxation. After an unknown amount of time, when the sect ruler felt that his body had lost and recovered tens of millions of times, the illusory connection finally reached its goal, which was to let the sect ruler feel the existence of his kind in that part of the world. As the illusory connection connected to that part of the world, an indescribable amount of information instantly surged towards the sect ruler through the illusory connection. The sect overlord instantly felt as though his mind was about to be shattered by the terrifying amount of information he had just received. After a long while, he finally caught his breath and regained his ability to think. This total amount of information is at least 100,000 times more than my world. This was the first thought that came to his mind when he came back to his senses. This information was just a sliver of information that leaked out during the process of communication between that part of the world and the other unattached realms. However, just these slivers of information that leaked out already brought him so much pressure that he almost couldn't breathe. This was enough to show just how huge the source of the information was. Based on this sect's ruler's understanding of the communication between the heavens and the earth, the amount of information exchanged was 100,000 times greater than the amount of information exchanged between his own world and the other unattached lands. This should be a relatively accurate number. Congratulations, fellow Taoist. At this moment, there was a piece of information that stood out from the leaked information. It was as if a paragraph of text had suddenly risen above all the other text on the screen that was originally filled with countless text. It occupied the main body of the screen and squeezed all the other text to a corner of the screen. Compared to the messages from the sect world and the other unattached lands, the message this time was even more prominent. Moreover, it was even clearer. To compare it to an ordinary mortal creation, the previous situation was like a radio receiving a broadcast signal. But now, it was like the phone had received a call. Sensing the subtle difference between the two, the sect's ruler relaxed and sent the information through the illusory connection. Thank you, fellow Taoist. If you hadn't made the method public, I'm afraid we would never have found out about it. At that moment, the dynasty's ruler could also sense the message from the sect overlord. Moreover, it felt similar to the message the sect overlord had sensed from him. After all, he had already established the illusory connection a long time ago. Otherwise, he would not have been able to directly let the sect overlord know what he was going to say to the sect overlord. At this moment, he naturally would not say that he had not made the method public willingly, but that it had been caused by the sudden changes in the world. Of course, he did not directly admit that he had made it public for the benefit of many cultivators. At that moment, he merely said a few words casually and changed the topic. He began to communicate with the sect overlord about various aspects of cultivation. Such an exchange was actually of limited help to the dynasty's ruler. After all, the sect overlord had only just become a tribulation stage powerhouse. He had yet to figure out the cultivation method of tribulation stage powerhouses, let alone explore breaking through to higher realms. However, the situation was obviously different for the sect overlord. The dynasty overlord's current realm was already close to the peak of tribulation stage powerhouses. Although he had yet to truly set foot on the peak, he was already many times more powerful than the sect overlord. Moreover, due to the many opportunities he had encountered, his understanding of tribulation stage powerhouses had reached an unimaginable depth. In terms of cultivation alone, ordinary 6 tribulation powerhouses would not even have much of an advantage over him. Under such circumstances, even if the dynasty overlord did not give him wholeheartedly guidance and only casually talked about some cultivation matters, it was already of great help to the sect overlord. At the very least, after this incident, the sect's ruler already knew that his previous cultivation had clearly lacked a unique view of the world, or perhaps it should be said that he lacked a link to construct his own unique worldview. When the exchange finally ended, the sect overlord was already deeply grateful to the dynasty overlord. He dare not say that he would completely submit to the other party, but at least under normal circumstances, he would not stand on the opposite side of the dynasty overlord. However, the dynasty's ruler was secretly delighted after the exchange ended. Naturally, he was not happy because the sect overlord had received his kindness, but because someone like the sect overlord had finally appeared. Although he had long guessed that there would be tribulation stage powerhouses like him, it was ultimately just a guess before someone like him actually appeared. Even if he was 99% confident, he could not guarantee that the remaining 1% would not appear. Therefore, when he finally saw his own kind and confirmed that things were as he had guessed, his own kind had indeed begun to appear. Naturally, he was happy. The sect overlord's appearance was like a switch that set off a wave of tribulation stage powerhouses appearing. In the following period of time, a few more places would appear in the undependent lands, and some tribulation stage powerhouses would appear. This was not really because the sect overlord's appearance caused some changes. Instead, it was because the sect overlord's appearance meant that many peak supreme emperors had enough time to think and prepare. Since they had enough time to think and prepare, those peak supreme emperors who wanted to transcend the world with existences they could not let go of would naturally start trying to transcend the world one after another. Once they started to try, it meant that such existences who had transcended the world would start to appear one after another in the land of no kin. Although the success rate of those peak supreme emperors trying to transcend the world with existences they could not let go of was not high, with so many worlds piled up and so many supreme emperors strung together, there would definitely be a lot of people who could transcend successfully. The dynasty's ruler naturally did not hold back when those tribulation stage powerhouses appeared. Every time one of them appeared, he would first establish contact with them and communicate with them. Through this method, he would establish a friendly relationship with those new tribulation stage powerhouses so that they would have some feelings for each other. This would lay a good foundation for further cooperation and breakthroughs in the future. Time gradually passed in this process. Unknowingly, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. After hundreds of thousands of years, the number of undependent lands that had transformed from places like the dynasty, which was also the number of tribulation stage powerhouses, had already reached close to 10,000. Although those tribulation stage powerhouses were still extremely far away from the true peak tribulation stage powerhouses that could truly bring benefits to the dynasty's ruler, it was only a matter of time. The dynasty's ruler felt extremely happy when he saw the good development, as if a bright future was right before him. However, this time, the dynasty's ruler shifted his attention from the outside world to the inside world. The reason for this was very simple. It was because one of the rulers that he had sent into reincarnation had finally completed the 10,000 reincarnations that he had set. He was finally going to completely awaken and recover. That being was none other than the ruler of a dynasty. His cultivation realm was the same as when he had ascended with the dynasty, which was the peak supreme emperor's realm. In this life, the ruler had reincarnated into a normal being in the dynasty that he had ruled. This was because the order of the dynasty was extremely orderly. Even normal beings had their own paths of ascension. As such, as the ruler of the dynasty, he rose through the paths of ascension. In the end, in just a short few hundred years, he had already raised his status to the level of the dynasty's prime minister. His strength had also risen steadily under the dynasty's support. He was only a step away from becoming a false saint. Of course, it had only been a short time, so the realm of strength that had risen still did not belong to him. He could only wait until he stayed in this position for a long time in the future, until he could comprehend his own path of cultivation from this elevated realm. Only then could he truly reach this realm, and only then could he truly raise his own level of existence to this level. Due to the adjustments made by the dynasty's ruler, the many traces and karma that he had left behind in the 10,000 reincarnations were being reined in this life. Layers of restraints were produced from various parts of the dynasty and connected to him, making him like a thread that was connected to almost every part of the entire dynasty. This kind of fetter not only hindered him, but also helped him. It was precisely because of these restraints and help that he was able to climb to his current position in just a few hundred years. It was also because of this that he was able to obtain such a degree of support from the dynasty, pushing his realm to a position close to the false saint stage. The reason why he had attracted the attention of the dynasty's ruler was that he had already started to condense his own path of cultivation. The cultivation realm that he had obtained had already started to gradually transform into his true state. It could be predicted that when he truly obtained his current realm, he would definitely break through his current realm and become a false saint. Once he truly became a false saint, the last layer of restraints that the dynasty's ruler had set back then would be completely broken. He would also completely recover all of his memories, recover all of his cultivation realm, and become the ruler of the dynasty again. This result was what the dynasty's ruler was looking forward to. At this moment, facing such a change, the dynasty's ruler quietly watched from the side, waiting for him to undergo the final transformation and complete the final step that he had been planning all along. At this moment, in the prime minister's residence of the dynasty, the ruler sat in the study room. There were all sorts of information carriers floating around him, and countless information constantly interacted with him during this process. Those information carriers were similar to memorials in the mortal world. At this moment, what the prime minister was doing was reading memorials. Of course, if it was an ordinary existence, what they were doing at this moment would only be reading memorials. However, when it came to the ruler, the situation was different. One must know that the dynasty was created by this cultivator. Just like that, the order in the great dynasty contained his cultivation path in the first place. Because ordinary cultivators did not have the same thoughts as the ruler of the dynasty, they would not be too affected by such order. At most, they would only be amazed by the strict and exquisite order of the dynasty. However, the situation was obviously different for the prime minister, who was the reincarnation of the dynasty's ruler. To him, the cultivation path hidden under this order that belonged to his previous life continuously surged into his heart as he gained a deeper understanding of this order. It gradually settled in the depths of his heart and turned into his deep foundation, waiting for the day when it would completely erupt. At this moment, it was obvious that the foundation had accumulated to the limit and was about to erupt. As he read through the memorials, the study room was gradually enveloped by a mysterious light. This light continued to expand, and in the end, it gradually enveloped the prime minister's residence that was like an Xian realm. Following this, it exited the Xian realm and headed towards the entire imperial capital of the dynasty. Chapter 31:27. In the end, the light enveloped the entire great dynasty empire's territory, completely enveloping the entire great dynasty empire within the light. When the light completely enveloped the entire empire, the ruler's cultivation realm began to rise endlessly. The enhancement of the realm that he had obtained from becoming the prime minister immediately transformed into his true cultivation realm. After that, he continued to rise and sublimate above this realm. False Saint, Despairing One, Supreme Emperor One. In the short span of a few days, he traversed a realm that would normally require hundreds of millions of years to traverse, and he'd brazenly attained the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm. When he completely reached the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm, countless memories surged out from the depths of his soul. It contained the memories of every reincarnation he had experienced, as well as the countless years he had spent suppressing the empire with the ruler of the empire before he had reincarnated. As these memories surfaced, the look in his eyes gradually changed. His gaze, which was already deep and unfathomable, became even more profound. Even his appearance gradually returned to how he looked before he was sent into the reincarnation cycle. One's appearance came from one's heart. When one's state of mind changed, one's appearance would naturally change as well. The ruler's state of mind returned to his state of mind before the reincarnation cycle, so his appearance would naturally return to how it was before. However, this change did not seem to be complete. In the end, although he had mostly returned to his original appearance, there were many details that made him look slightly different from before he had reincarnated 10,000 times. Evidently, the 10,000 reincarnations still had an effect on him. His majesty is indeed his majesty. After returning to his senses, the ruler smiled bitterly. No matter what, he was a peak of the Supreme Emperor. Previously, he had been muddle-headed and did not know about the ruler's plan. Now that he had completely woken up, the many clearly arranged encounters that he had encountered in the reincarnation cycle were naturally as obvious as lice on a bald man's head. Naturally, he understood what the dynasty's ruler was planning when he saw the traces clearly. However, although he smiled bitterly, he did not reject his encounters in the reincarnation cycle. Although those encounters had obvious or obscure signs of being arranged by someone, the emotions in them were real. The emotions he felt were real, and so were the fetters that were born from these encounters. The experiences of the 10,000 reincarnations had clearly left an extremely deep mark in his life. It had long become an inseparable part of him. If that wasn't the case, how could his current appearance have changed because of the reincarnation cycle? From this point of view, he should actually be grateful to the dynasty's ruler. He should be grateful to him for giving him these opportunities and allowing him to obtain so many restraints. Of course, this was only in theory. In reality, after being arranged to reincarnate for 10,000 times, he was unwilling to be grateful to the dynasty's ruler no matter what. Even if he didn't bear a grudge against the other party, he definitely wouldn't feel happy about this arrangement. Since you want me to transcend, then I shall transcend. As he sighed, he did not hesitate at all and began to control the light that enveloped the entire dynasty. He began to collect the various resources that existed in the dynasty and gather them at where he was. As a supreme ruler who had participated in the preparation of the dynasty's ruler's transcendence, the dynasty's ruler naturally knew what the key to transcendence was. Therefore, he did not have to be like the overlord of the sect and could only copy everything that the dynasty's ruler had done. However, he could directly grasp the key points and create his own transcendence method. At this moment, what he gathered countless resources to build was not an altar, but a map. It was a strange map that looked like a sand table. The map corresponded to all the regions within the territory of the dynasty. Everything that truly existed in the territory of the dynasty could be found on the map. In fact, the living beings in the great empire also had a corresponding life form. At this moment, all the living beings in the dynasty suddenly felt an indescribable feeling welling up in their hearts. Although the dynasty world had transcended from another world, and all the living beings in it had been brought out by the ruler of the dynasty world from another world, the dynasty world was still the same. But because too much time had passed, it was too late. Currently, there were very few living beings in the great empires who had transcended the world back then. Almost all the living beings in the dynasty were the descendants of that batch of living beings. To them, transcendence was something that they had only heard about in the legends left behind by their ancestors. Almost none of them had truly experienced it. Under such circumstances, the sudden and subtle feeling in front of them made them completely unable to figure out what was going on. Even the beings who had experienced transcendence in the past couldn't associate this feeling with transcendence at all. However, very soon, all the living beings, be it those who had experienced transcendence or those who had not, would truly understand what this feeling represented. This was because as the map was established, the entire dynasty began to gradually become one. The connection between it and the surrounding dynasties and the world of the dynasty also began to be gradually separated in the process. The great dynasty began to tremble violently due to this change. An indescribable sense of transcendence began to gradually seep out from all the regions within the boundaries of the great dynasty. Soon after, the voice of the great dynasty's ruler spread through all the regions of the dynasty and reached the hearts of all the living beings within the boundaries of the great dynasty. It allowed them to instantly understand what was going to happen next, as well as how much benefit it would bring them. Who would not want to be able to raise their cultivation level, or even several levels, without any side effects. Hence, in just a few breaths' time, all the living beings within the boundaries of the great dynasty knelt in the direction of the territory of the dynasty and began to pray piously. It was just like what the living beings had done before the world of the great dynasty had transcended. As the thoughts of the living beings gathered, the territory of the great dynasty, which was originally a miniature state, began to shine brightly and gradually expand, as if it was going to expand to the size of the entire great dynasty. At this moment, the body of the great dynasty's ruler moved and appeared on the territory. His body trembled slightly and directly fused with the territory, becoming one with it. With this change, the territory seemed to have suddenly come alive. The sense of transcendence that it gave off became even more intense, and the speed at which it expanded also became faster. As the great dynasty began to change, the ruler of the great dynasty, who had completely become the overlord of the world, saw everything that was happening. Looks like he understands my thoughts. At this moment, a thought flashed across his mind. As for whether the ruler of the great empire would bear a grudge against him, he wasn't worried at all. Even if his previous arrangements for the ruler of the great dynasty's reincarnation made the ruler feel humiliated, as long as the ruler of the great dynasty successfully transcended and obtained benefits from it, the ruler would definitely be grateful to him. Compared to a breakthrough in his cultivation realm, what were the opportunities in the reincarnation arrangements? Of course, if the ruler of the great dynasty failed to transcend, there would be even less to say. If they all failed, then they would naturally die and their Tao would vanish. Nothing would exist. In that case, even if the ruler of the great dynasty bore a grudge against him, what impact would it have on him? He had already achieved transcendence once, and he had also watched others do it. However, he was still unfamiliar with the effects of transcendence on himself when a cultivator in his own world did it. At this moment, he watched the ruler of the great dynasty transcend with the great dynasty, but a large part of his mind was focused on the world. He carefully experienced the changes that were happening to the world during the process of transcending, tearing out a large piece of flesh. The ruler of the great dynasty finally made a judgment after carefully experiencing the changes in the world. At this moment, to the world, it felt like a large piece of flesh was slowly being torn out. It was definitely not a good feeling. In fact, the ruler of the great dynasty could even hear the world groaning in pain. No wonder there's a tribulation. The ruler of the great dynasty sighed inwardly. He changed his original plan of using his authority to weaken the tribulation that the ruler of the great dynasty encountered. With his almost absolute authority in the great dynasty, he could even forcefully eliminate the tribulation that the ruler of the great dynasty transcended, let alone weaken it. However, if he did that, it would be equivalent to stopping a person from crying out in pain when their flesh was torn off. It was simply a request that went against nature. If he really requested the world not to impose a tribulation on the ruler of the great dynasty, the world would definitely resent him. If there was too much resentment, it might affect his authority in the great dynasty. It had not been easy for him to raise his authority in the great dynasty to such a level. How could he squander it for someone else? Therefore, at this moment, he could only watch the boundless energy in the world gathering in the great dynasty's territory. It gradually formed a tribulation cloud that shrouded the entire great dynasty's territory. The ruler of the great dynasty naturally expected the appearance of the tribulation. After all, he had also experienced the process of the ruler of the great dynasty transcending. Even when he recalled the terrifying tribulation back then, he still felt terrified. Now, it was his turn to transcend with the great dynasty. How could he avoid the tribulation? Time flew by, and 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. In those 3 years, the territory above the great dynasty had expanded to the point where it completely overlapped with the entire great dynasty's territory. Everything in the great dynasty had completely merged into one with the overlap, as if it had truly become a living creature. Above the great dynasty, the tribulation cloud that shrouded the entire great dynasty had been brewing for 3 years. After 3 years of brewing, the tribulation cloud was like a black hole, and not a single ray of light shone out. Moreover, the power gathered within it had already reached an indescribable level. It was as if a tiny bit of it was enough to destroy the world. It has begun. On this day, those 3 words flashed through the ruler's mind. As those 3 words flashed through his mind, endless attacks began to erupt from the tribulation cloud, and they bombarded the great dynasty below. The ruler of the great empire was naturally well prepared for this tribulation that he had been waiting for 3 years. At this moment, he was rather calm in the face of such an attack. He mobilized the power and might of the entire great empire and gently loosened his grip on the children's palace, completely eliminating the first wave of attacks that no one knew how many. However, this was clearly only the first wave. After brewing for 3 years, how could this tribulation only be a single wave of attacks? Endless attacks continued to erupt from the tribulation cloud. There were all sorts of strange and bizarre attacks, and they poured down on the great dynasty as if there was no end to them. At the same time, there were also all sorts of unbelievable attacks erupting from the tribulation cloud, and they continuously poured down on the great dynasty. This tribulation lasted for almost 1,000 years before it slowly came to a stop. There is no need to mention the destructive power of a tribulation that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. Even if the ruler of the great dynasty had made all the preparations and was experienced, and his methods were sufficiently brilliant, he still could not withstand this tribulation without suffering any losses. In the end, although he had managed to protect the great empire from the calamity of 1,000 years, the great empire had already become riddled with holes. The territory and lives that had been lost had taken up nearly 30% of the great empire's population. The great loss was enough to make the ruler of the great dynasty feel indescribable heartache. He even vaguely felt intense hatred for the ruler of the great dynasty who had caused all of this. As the tribulation dissipated, the transcendence light shrouded the great dynasty, and it began to gradually fade along with the great dynasty, slowly disappearing from the world of the great dynasty. Chapter 31:28. With the disappearance of the great dynasty, the experts who were originally watching started to move. Although the ruler of the great dynasty was the first among the many rulers who had been punished to break free from his shackles and recover. However, while he was undergoing the tribulation of transcendence, the other rulers had all broken free from their shackles one after another, recovering their true selves and abilities. After all of them had experienced 10,000 reincarnations. Even though there was a difference in time, the difference wouldn't be too big. The great dynasties had been going through the tribulation for such a long time, but it was enough for many rulers to complete the reincarnation cycle and recover completely. After they recovered, they knew what the dynasty's ruler was thinking. Naturally, all of them wanted to transcend like the ruler of the great dynasty. However, it was obvious that they were a step slower than the ruler of the great empire. Even though they were unhappy with the dynasty's ruler and wanted to leave this world as soon as possible, their rationality stopped them from seeking death when there were other existences undergoing their heavenly tribulations. As a result, they had only been paying attention to how the ruler of the empire was going to pass the heavenly tribulation. They did not attempt to pass the heavenly tribulation themselves. At this moment, as the ruler of the great dynasties successfully passed the heavenly tribulation, their previous worries naturally no longer existed. Of course, they would begin to attempt the transcendence that they had been looking forward to for a long time. As a result, in the following period of time, the transcendence of the world and the dynasty rose one after another. One after another, the rulers led the regions they ruled over to trigger the tribulation of transcendence, attempting to transcend. Of course, not every ruler succeeded. Among them, about 30% failed. As for the rest, even if they succeeded, they rarely came out unscathed. In the process of transcending, almost every ruler had caused their territories to be damaged, big or small. Although they weren't riddled with scars, every one of them had clearly suffered a considerable disaster. Time slowly passed. When all the changes had calmed down, the dynasty was already in a state of desolation. The traces left behind by the transcendence of the entire world were everywhere. Numerous space-time rifts filled every corner of the world, causing the entire world to seem to have shrunk by more than 100 times. This was only the damage that appeared on the surface of the world. In the depths of the world, in an even more fundamental place, the very foundation of the world had also suffered great damage. Every time he transcended the world, it was equivalent to tearing a piece of flesh from the world of the dynasty. In this way, when this kind of behavior was relatively rare, it would only hurt for a while for the dynasty's heaven and earth. Its self-healing ability could quickly restore the heaven and earth to its original state. However, when this behavior was repeated time and time again, the situation was obviously different. Just like how losing too much flesh and blood could be fatal to a person, it was the same for the world. When the number of transcendents exceeded a certain limit, the world could no longer maintain its original stability. At this moment, the world was like an old man with one foot in the grave, and he seemed to be approaching death at every moment. Every time heaven and earth revolved, it was as if it was struggling before death. Although Dynasty's ruler did not really expect such a situation, he had thought about the possibility of such a thing happening. Under such a situation, he still dared to urge the many rulers to transcend. Naturally, it was because he was confident that he could deal with such a situation even if it happened. At this moment, facing the situation of Dynasty's world, the ruler fully integrated himself into the world. Then, with a slight movement of his heart, boundless energy and boundless might continuously surged out of his body and began to rapidly integrate into this world. As the energy and might surged in, the world slowed down slightly. Although he had yet to break free from the situation where he was about to die, at the very least, it seemed like his life had been extended and he was a little further away from true death. The damage to the world was a kind of damage at the root, so it was naturally impossible to repair it by just integrating power and might into it. Clearly, he needed to do more if he wanted to repair the world. Naturally, Dynasty's ruler knew that very well. At this moment, he did not place his hopes on that. At this moment, he was not surprised at all as he faced the situation of Dynasty's world. Instead, his mind gradually entered an indescribable, wonderful realm. In this realm, the countless concepts that he had sorted out through various methods over the past few days that belonged to him began to surface from the depths of his soul bit by bit. They began to gradually merge with an indescribable existence outside of his body. As a tribulation powerhouse, even though he had only sorted out his unique worldview for a few billion years, the number of concepts that he could sort out was absolutely unimaginable. Of course, there were naturally very few that could truly be maintained until the end and become the worldview that he ultimately achieved in the future. However, there was no need for all of them to be near-perfect concepts that could be maintained until the end. What he needed at this moment was a considerable number of concepts. As he did that, time passed bit by bit. It seemed like tens of millions of years, but it seemed like only a few breaths had passed. He gradually broke away from the indescribable, wonderful realm. As he broke away from that realm, he suddenly felt that the world around him had undergone a tremendous change. The original scene of devastation had completely disappeared without a trace. The damage on the world's foundation could not be seen at all. The entire world seemed to have returned to its perfect state, as if no disaster had ever happened. Of course, the size of the world was still much smaller than it was in the beginning when there was no ruler who had transcended. The area was probably only 1/10 of what it used to be. "I've succeeded," Dynasty's ruler revealed, a faint smile as he looked at the world situation. At this moment, apart from the changes on the surface, there was a more fundamental change. The aura that belonged to Dynasty's ruler had been reduced by hundreds or even thousands of times. It was replaced by another aura, an aura that belonged to Dynasty's ruler. The aura filled every inch of the dynasty, causing the entire dynasty to seem as if it had transformed into another body of the dynasty's ruler. Meanwhile, the operation of the various rules, and even the operation of the great Tao, gave the dynasty's ruler an indescribable sense of familiarity. It was as if everything was going according to his thoughts. Of course, there were still too many operating methods that he could not understand. However, even those operating methods that he could not understand seemed to have been sublimated from the operating methods that he could understand and recognize. Such a situation was a sign that the dynasty's ruler had completely replaced the dynasty's fundamental concept with his own concept. With such a change, the dynasty's ruler seemed like the founder of the dynasty at this moment. Facing such a world, the dynasty's ruler looked more and more satisfied. He spread his consciousness and sensed the operation of all the rules in the dynasty at all times. He sensed how the concepts that he knew were reflected in the overall operation of the dynasty, which ideas were not distorted in the slightest during this process, and which ideas were distorted to the extreme, turning into something that seemed right but was actually wrong. Through this understanding, he quickly distinguished that among the ideas that he had sorted out for billions of years and belonged to himself, only a very, very small part could perfectly integrate with this side of the world. Most of the remaining ones, or even almost all of them, were not compatible in one way or another. They needed to undergo a certain distortion before they could truly fuse with the operation of the world's rules. There's indeed a huge problem. If I hadn't discovered this, I'm afraid I'd have to walk on the wrong path for a long time before I could wake up. In the end, the dynasty's ruler sighed and broke away from the state of comprehension. The concepts that did not change at all in the operation of the world and perfectly fused with the world were truly perfect, or at least relatively perfect concepts. For the current him, this concept was clearly enough to form the foundation of his path of cultivation. On the other hand, the concepts that could not adapt to the operation of the world and needed to undergo a certain distortion before they could fuse with the operation of the world were clearly imperfect. They still needed to be modified time and time again before they could become the foundation of his path of cultivation. If he did not distinguish all of that and treated all of those concepts as the foundation of his path of cultivation, he might end up being doomed eternally in the future. Initially, integrating those concepts into the operation of the world to check if they were perfect was merely a cultivation that the dynasty's ruler had done in passing. In reality, he did not think that it was very important at first, nor did he think that there would be any problems with the concepts that he sorted out. However, the final outcome made him realize that he had been too arrogant before. The importance of the cultivation that he had done in passing was far beyond his imagination. It could even be said that even if all of his previous plans had failed, and the rulers who had transcended the world did not owe him a favor and were unwilling to study cultivation methods with him, the gains he had reaped were enough to make up for the hundreds of thousands of years of planning he had put in place. The dynasty's ruler's heart skipped a beat, and his body trembled. Wisps of subtle mist constantly escaped from his body, gradually dissipating into the surrounding void. In the end, they turned into all kinds of indescribable energy and power, disappearing into the world, and could no longer be found. As the changes occurred, his aura began to weaken. His cultivation base that was almost at the peak stage of a calamity stage powerhouse had weakened to the beginner stage of a calamity stage powerhouse in a short period of time. In other words, it had weakened to the level when he had barely broken through peak stage Supreme Emperor and become a calamity stage powerhouse. Of course, compared to before, he was still very different after all. The biggest difference was that his level was many times more stable than before. Back when he had just broken through, his cultivation base was full of flaws and loopholes. It looked like the frame of a tall building. Yet now, after experiencing that series of changes, his cultivation had already stabilized like an eternally unmoving rock. Not only was there not a single flaw, there wasn't even a single flaw to be seen. Faintly, there seemed to be some kind of potential brewing within him. It was as if his cultivation base might go through a drastic improvement in the next second. The reason for that was actually very simple. It was because he had truly integrated the relatively perfect concepts that Dynasty and Heaven and Earth had confirmed could be accepted by Heaven and Earth into his cultivation path. Meanwhile, he had completely removed the concepts that were not accepted by Heaven and Earth from his cultivation path, which required a certain amount of distortion before they could truly integrate with Heaven and Earth. Through this change, he once again solidified his cultivation level, making his cultivation level even more stable. After carefully sensing his own cultivation path, the dynasty's ruler even sensed a subtle eternal charm in his cultivation path. This was a kind of charm that he had never sensed in his own cultivation path before. The moment he sensed the charm, he knew that everything he had done before was correct. Although it seemed like his cultivation base had weakened by many times, the weakening was completely worth it compared to what he had gained. I'll need to be extremely cautious when adding every concept. I'll need to confirm it again and again so that there won't be any hidden dangers left. The dynasty's ruler secretly concluded the cultivation principle of a tribulation powerhouse. He felt that he had finally truly stepped onto the true cultivation path of a tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, there were still all sorts of indescribable information being poured into the endless world outside the dynasty at every moment through the subtle connection. Meanwhile, there's also a large amount of information flowing into dynasty through the subtle connection at the same time. The information that was exchanged throughout the entire process was even much more than before Dynasty was damaged. It seemed like the endless world knew that Dynasty was damaged, so it was giving resources to Dynasty. It also seemed like the endless world was very interested in the changes in Dynasty. Chapter 31:29. As the communication continued to strengthen, the dynasty's world began to obtain additional opportunities to recover in addition to the means of the dynasty's ruler. The entire world was like a baby beast that was waiting to be fed, and it began to obtain endless existences from nothingness. The entire world began to expand in all directions at a speed visible to the naked eye. The vitality in the world also increased crazily during this process. The world, which had originally become desolate due to the transcendence of many empires, dynasties, and countries, became more and more lively as the vitality recovered. Of course, with the increase of living beings and the recovery of vitality, it was naturally impossible to directly return to how it was before the many forces transcended. Instead, it had to start from zero again, slowly moving from primitive to civilized, from disorder to order, and gradually bringing the entire world back to how it was before. Faced with such a situation, the dynasty's ruler finally let out a long sigh of relief. Although he had already obtained what he needed from the many rulers transcending, he was still rather concerned about this world. If there was no other way in the end, this world would definitely be damaged, and he could only accept it. He would not regret his decision because of this world's outcome. However, as long as there was a slight possibility of restoring this world, he would definitely put in all his effort for this outcome. Under such circumstances, he naturally let out a sigh of relief when he discovered that this world could recover at an extremely fast speed. As the world gradually recovered, the many concepts that he integrated into this world also began to undergo various subtle changes. During this process, each of these concepts began to evolve into all sorts of secondary existences, causing each of these concepts to gradually become colossal existences. It was as if the branches were gradually turning into tree trunks, and a large number of branches and leaves were growing again. In this process, the dynasty's ruler felt that his understanding of those concepts began to gradually deepen. These branches and leaves were derived from the concepts that he had sorted out. Their foundation could be said to be the concepts that he had sorted out. These derivations were like the position of the concepts in the world, their use in the world, their effects on the world, and so on. Through this elaboration, he even faintly felt that he could sort out more relatively perfect concepts, of course. This was just an illusion. Although a worldview contained almost infinite concepts, not every concept could be seamlessly integrated into the worldview. Concepts that were derived from the concepts that he had already sorted out would obviously not be accepted by the worldview. For example, if someone wanted to collect all the fruits in the world, it was referring to a large number of different types of fruits. It wasn't as simple as picking a few types of fruits and stacking them on top of each other. In terms of the worldview, the ideas derived from these ideas were like the individual shapes of a certain fruit. Although it looked very different from the fruits he had collected before, the essence was still the same. Such a concept naturally did not help much in the establishment of a worldview. If he wanted to obtain other concepts, he would need to think about certain phenomena and explain certain phenomena that existed in the universe and even higher realms. Furthermore, the explanation had to be reasonable and logical, and it had to be in line with his true thoughts. Only then would he be able to form a new concept. In fact, he had already completed the most basic step on this point. Even if the concepts that he had established previously could only be considered to be a small and insignificant part of them, at least the remaining concepts were not without merit. At the very least, they had established the foundation of many concepts. After that, what the dynasty's ruler needed to do was to modify and rebuild these concepts that had not even reached a relatively perfect state. In the process of rebuilding, these concepts that still had huge loopholes and flaws would be perfected, of course, in the process. He naturally still needed to explain more phenomena and establish more conceptual foundations. Just like that, he repeated the cycle again and again until he finally broke through the shackles and bottlenecks one by one. In the end, the concepts that he had truly established could form a complete and perfect worldview. By then, he would naturally become a true sage and obtain true eternity, true immortality, true indestructibility, true omniscience, true omnipotence, true omnipotence, true omnipotence, true omnipotence. Of course, although it was only a process, in reality, it was so difficult to truly cross this process that it simply surpassed the limits of all living beings' imagination. From the birth of a world until the end of time, it would take billions of trillions of years and billions of trillions of cultivators. If there were only a few dozen who could truly complete this process, it would already be considered a great fortune for the world. From this, one could tell how difficult it was to cross this process. At this moment, the dynasty's ruler naturally did not know how difficult this process was. At this moment, he did not think too much about what state he could achieve after establishing all the concepts needed for a worldview. At this moment, he only felt that this process was a form of cultivation, although he knew that it would be extremely long. However, in his heart, he did not treat this as a standard to measure his cultivation realm. In fact, he even began to think about how he should cultivate after establishing these concepts, of course. Such a shallow understanding could only be seen by a cultivator who was born and raised in this island branch like him. However, it was also because he did not truly understand the difficulty that he was full of confidence at this moment. He felt that he would eventually be able to complete this process one day. When the dynasty's ruler began to work hard to help this world recover to its original state, the cultivators who had transcended from the world that they ruled began to leave the transcendence passage one after another. Compared to the positions that the cultivators from the other island branches appeared after transcending from the world, the positions that the cultivators from the dynasty's world formed after transcending from the world that they ruled were rather special. This special characteristic caused an intense reaction from the yellow world that transcended from the world. Whenever a small world left the transcendence passage, the dynasty's ruler would feel its world tremble violently for a while. Vaguely, there was even some kind of inexplicable force acting on the dynasty's world, causing to lift up a little in a certain direction. Faced with such a situation, how could the dynasty's ruler continue to immerse himself in this world? He naturally turned his gaze to the world outside. They become a lower branch. With the help of the communication between the endless worlds, he soon discovered where the small worlds that had transcended from the dynasty's world had gone. The places where these worlds appeared were all under the dynasty's world. It was as if the dynasty's world was a layer below another world. However, what was different was that the worlds that had transcended from the dynasty's world were not stacked layer by layer. Instead, many worlds appeared at the same time and appeared side by side under the dynasty's world. If one were to make an analogy, the structure between the dynasty's world and the upper world, or even the upper world, was like a structure of bamboo joints. In other words, there was only one heaven and earth that came down from a higher level. If another heaven and earth wanted to join this system, it could only superimpose itself on the lower level of this heaven and earth and become the lower level of this heaven and earth. Just like that, the layers of heaven and earth continued to be superimposed on each other. However, the situation in the dynasty's world was not like this at this moment. At this moment, there seemed to be densely packed roots under the dynasty's world, and a considerable number of small worlds became the lower world of the dynasty's world. There was no difference between the upper and lower worlds between those small worlds, and they were almost in a state of parallel. With such a structure, if the cultivators in these small worlds transcended, they would transcend to the same world no matter if they transcended inwards or outwards. It was not the same direction inwards and outwards, but the same world inwards and outwards were different from when they transcended inwards, but they were the same world to both parties. If they transcended outwards, they would naturally enter the dynasty's world. On the other hand, if they transcended inwards, they would transcend to the lower worlds of these small worlds. From a macroscopic perspective, it was as if a bamboo had suddenly split into a large number of branches when it came to the world of the dynasty. Then, these branches only lasted for one bamboo joint before they gathered again on the next bamboo joint. It looked as if a certain section of the bamboo had suddenly bulged out a big circle. With such a change, the communication between the dynasty's world and the other endless worlds suddenly skyrocketed. Or, to be more specific, the amount of information it received from the other worlds had suddenly skyrocketed. It was as if it had suddenly gained a large number of organs to receive information. Sensing such a change, the dynasty's ruler naturally understood that these small worlds that had transcended had also become its own world's organs to receive information from the other endless worlds. So, the world that transcends has such an effect. As he thought of this, he was slightly stunned. It was because he suddenly remembered that his dynasty's world seemed to have also transcended from another world. If the world that transcended would become the organ to receive information from the world before transcending, would his dynasty's world also become the organ to receive information from the world before transcending? However, it did not seem to be the case. At least, the dynasty's world was not directly on the next layer of the world that it had transcended from. This was fundamentally different from the other small worlds that transcended from the dynasty's world, which were on the next layer of the dynasty's world. Could it be because there are no powerhouses who have entered the tribulation in that world? The thought surfaced in his mind. With this thought, he heaved a sigh of relief. Although his dynasty's world becoming the organ to receive information from other worlds did not affect the dynasty's world much, and it would not be weakened because of this. On the contrary, it could faintly receive some kind of subtle enhancement. However, this was only a rational understanding. Emotionally, if such a situation happened, he would still feel a little uncomfortable. It was like a person knowing that he was a tool that was being used by others, although such use would not affect him much, and he could even gain many benefits from such a use. However, even if one could see reality clearly, it was impossible for him to not have any grudges about such an encounter. In the depths of his heart, there was bound to be rejection towards this. If there were other choices, even if the benefits would be lesser, there would definitely be many people who would make other choices. It was the same for the dynasty's ruler. Although becoming the organ to receive information from the world that he had transcended would not affect him much, he did not feel great when he thought that his world was being used. If such a use required a powerhouse who had entered the tribulation in that world as a prerequisite, the possibility of it being used naturally did not exist. One should not forget how powerhouses who had entered the tribulation became. The achievements of powerhouses who had entered the tribulation completely relied on transcending the world. In other words, if there were no powerhouses who had entered the tribulation in that world, there would no longer be any powerhouses who had entered the tribulation in that world. After all, that world had already been formed. Even if there were cultivators in the upper worlds who had transcended the world, it would be impossible for them to enter that world. Therefore, if that was really the limit, it would mean that there was no possibility of the dynasty's world being used as an organ to receive information from that world. This naturally made him heave a sigh of relief. At this moment, in the many small worlds under the dynasty's world, the cultivators also broke through one by one. Not all of these cultivators who had transcended the world in the area they ruled were peak supreme emperors. There were also false saints and hopeless ones among them. After they transcended, although they had also broken through, not all of them could become powerhouses who had entered the tribulation. Only the breakthroughs obtained by supreme emperors after transcending the world could allow them to become powerhouses who had entered the tribulation. After false saints transcended the world, they only advanced their cultivation realm to the level of hopeless ones. On the other hand, after hopeless ones transcended the world, they only advanced their cultivation realm to the level of supreme emperors. Chapter 31:30. Of course, those false saints did not waste the opportunity to break through by taking such a huge risk to transcend. Although they did not directly become tribulation stage powerhouses, they had already removed the barrier between peak supreme emperor stage and tribulation stage powerhouses. In other words, although they were still despaired or supreme emperor stage powerhouses, they would naturally be able to break through this realm and become tribulation stage powerhouses when they reach the peak supreme emperor stage. Transcending this time was like planting the seeds of tribulation stage powerhouses in their bodies. When the time was right, they would be able to bloom and naturally become tribulation stage powerhouses. From a certain point of view, their method was even more brilliant than the method of those peak supreme emperor stage powerhouses. After all, those peak supreme emperor stage powerhouses had been stuck at this peak realm for trillions of years and suffered for countless times before finally obtaining this opportunity to break through. On the other hand, they did not need to go through this torturous process at all. As long as their realm was sufficient, they would naturally be able to break through. Apart from that, because their cultivation realm was insufficient, the tribulation they encountered when they transcended was much weaker than the tribulation the peak supreme emperor stage powerhouses encountered when they transcended. From this perspective, their chances of successfully transcending the tribulation were much higher. Of course, although there seemed to be benefits everywhere, this method was not without its weaknesses. The greatest weakness was that because their realm was insufficient, the area they could transcend was much smaller than those peak supreme emperor stage powerhouses. For example, cultivators who were originally peak-level supreme emperors, after they transcended from the world, their small worlds could easily transform into real worlds. However, they were different. Although they could barely transform their area of transcendence into a small world in the transcendence passage. However, if they wanted to nurture this small world into a real world, it was obviously not something that could be done in a short period of time. Perhaps only when they truly became tribulation stage powerhouses would they be able to transform this small world into a real world. Before that, the cultivator had to spend a lot of energy on this small world to maintain the integrity of this small world. He had to help this small world resist any pressure and danger that might affect the stability of this small world. On the other hand, this would obviously affect his cultivation instead, causing the speed at which his cultivation improved to be much slower than usual. Therefore, whether this choice was worth it or not, it was up to the individual to decide. At this moment, the transcendent cultivators were carefully sensing the changes in their territories and their bodies. As they successfully transcended the world, They began to sense an indescribable exchange of information between their own small world and the endless worlds outside. Endless information kept pouring into their small world, constantly enriching the foundation of this small world, pushing this small world towards the real world. At the same time, information continuously surged out of their many worlds and flowed into the endless world, causing the endless world to gradually undergo some insignificant and subtle changes. It felt as if they were breathing with each other. At the same time, they also sensed that there were some places in the endless world that they were familiar with. There seemed to be existences similar to them. In other words, he was also a transcendent being. After this period of time, the number of transcendent cultivators in the endless world increased a lot compared to before. After all, the development of different worlds was relatively independent. If they wanted to transcend, they would only look at their own situation. They wouldn't care about the situation in the other worlds, and they wouldn't care if other cultivators had already transcended. Therefore, sometimes there would be a long period of time without such a transcendent being appearing, but sometimes there would be a large number of such cultivators going to transcend. At this moment, there were already dozens of such transcendent beings in the endless world. This didn't include the people who had transcended from the dynasties. As the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses increased, the number of interactions between them naturally increased. As the number of exchanges increased, the number of valuable exchanges naturally increased. The various characteristics of transcending the world were also gradually summed up in this kind of exchange. What were the limitations of transcendence? What were the advantages? What was the weakest requirement for one's cultivation base? How would the strength of one's cultivation base affect the tribulations they would face, and so on and so forth? All of this information was summarized as they conversed with each other. These transcendent beings all had different feelings for their own world. Some were extremely indifferent, feeling that everything they cared about had already transcended and left the world. Some still had extremely deep feelings for the world before they transcended. They felt that the world was still their root, and that the living beings in the world still had a different relationship with them. The transcendent beings who didn't have any feelings for their original world naturally wouldn't transmit the information they summarized back to their original world. However, those who had deep feelings for their original world wouldn't be stingy with this kind of effort. As long as cultivators made this choice, the information they summarized naturally wouldn't be a secret. Gradually, it would become common knowledge in the endless world. As this common knowledge was gradually made public, all kinds of transcendent beings gradually increased. For example, the false sage level transcendent beings, the despair level transcendent beings, and the supreme emperor level transcendent beings appeared more and more in the endless world. Or rather, they appeared in different branches of the islands. After billions of years, the atmosphere of the countless islands seemed to be completely different from before. Personal transcendence was no longer the mainstream of the countless islands. Instead, it was the transcendence of the entire world. And in each island branch, there were more or less some worlds that had appeared due to the transcendence of the entire world. And in the endless communication between the worlds that only the transcendence could sense, the transcendence had already formed an extremely huge circle. Their ability to communicate across countless island branches allowed their knowledge to not be limited by a single island branch at all. Their understanding of the world, their understanding of cultivation, and their understanding of transcendence had already far surpassed the cultivators who were limited to a certain island branch. It could be said that in this aspect, even those 6 tribulation powerhouses who worked hard in a branch of an island and helped that branch to continuously improve and expand could not compare to them. This kind of change, however, made Luo Fan, who seemed to be in the midst of countless island branches at the same time, feel quite satisfied. The development in front of him was something he had not expected. It could be said that it was an unexpected gain. In the beginning, he had built this island in the layer of the nothingness ocean to imitate the cultivation of other cultivators. Even though he had finally built it, he was still at a loss about its use. In the end, Because of a certain coincidence, he comprehended the essence of this island and understood that this island was a simulation of his own heavens. Through the communication between this island and the nothingness ocean, it could accelerate the communication between his heavens and the nothingness ocean, so that his heavens could evolve faster, so that he could move faster on the 6th level of the road to Tao Master, and also obtain more benefits that he wanted. After that, the many branches of the island served this purpose. By relying on the continuous branches of the island's tentacles reached more layers of the nothingness ocean, and finally, the island's communication with the nothingness ocean became more frequent, and the scale of the communication between his own heavens and the nothingness ocean became closer. The fact proved that he had made the right choice. From the beginning of his understanding of this key point, he could almost always obtain benefits from this island and its many branches that he could not obtain before. The speed at which his heavens evolved and the speed at which his cultivation realm improved were also much faster than before. From a certain point of view, from the beginning of the island's evolution to this step, all of this could be regarded as his plan. Even the development that he did not expect in advance did not exceed the framework of his final expectations. However, since the beginning of the dynasty's ruler's world transcendence, things became a little bit different. The emergence of world transcendence seemed to open up a whole new world, suddenly expanding the cultivation methods that originally did not have much future and redeeming features on this island, and even the many branches of the island. Apart from leaving the island branches and leaving the 6th layer of the Tao Master's path, there was another possibility for the cultivators in the many branches of the island to break through. Although at the beginning they could barely step into the tribulation realm, it was obvious that this was only temporary. Compared to those who had world transcendence who still could not find their direction and did not know which direction to work toward to achieve further breakthroughs, Luo Fan, whose vision was far superior to those who had world transcendence, had long understood the direction that they should move forward in. At this time, the reason why these cultivators' cultivation realm was shackled at the tribulation realm and could not break through was because the types and number of heavens and earths that they could communicate with were too few. Because there were too few types of heavens and earths, they could not come into contact with as many types of heavens and earths as possible. It was difficult for them to understand the possibilities of heavens and earths, the possibilities of worldviews, the possibilities of rules and principles, and the possibilities of great Tao. There were too few heavens and earths, so they did not have enough samples to summarize the essence of a certain type of heavens and earths. Because of these two limitations, their current cultivation realm could only be stagnated at the tribulation realm. One day, when the types and number of heavens and earths met the requirements, this bottleneck will be broken by itself. At that time, the shackles of cultivation realm would also be relaxed to the 2nd tribulation realm. After that, the types and number of heavens and earths would increase by several orders of magnitude. The 2nd tribulation realm would no longer be an obstacle, and the final limit of cultivation realm would be relaxed to the 3 tribulation realm. Of course, it was obviously not that easy to increase by several orders of magnitude. At least, compared to breaking the shackles of the tribulation realm, the difficulty would at least be increased by at least 1,000,000 times. After that, the shackles of the 3 tribulation realm would also be broken through in a similar way. However, the difficulty might be increased by tens of millions of times on the basis of breaking through the shackles of the 2nd tribulation realm. From a certain point of view, the potential of the island branches could be said to be infinite. If they really developed to the limit, these island branches might even be able to cultivate the 6th tribulation realm. As long as the number and types of heavens and earths could meet the requirements, Luo Fan could clearly see this point, but he naturally would not directly tell this matter to the numerous transcendents of the island branches. First of all, the most important reason was that he was equivalent to an external force for the many island branches. If he personally told them things that they should not know, it might break the equilibrium of the many island branches. It would cause the communication between the island branches and the ocean layer of nothingness to be directly interrupted. If that was really the case, then no matter how many benefits the transcendents obtained from his reminder, it would be an absolute loss for him. Secondly, even if he didn't remind them, Those who had transcended would only need a little more time to get the answer. Nowadays, the number of transcendents was increasing, and their communication was becoming more frequent and deeper. Naturally, they would have a deeper understanding of the direction of their cultivation. Grasping the essence and obtaining the final answer was obviously only a matter of time. In any case, the flow of time in the island branches was billions of times faster than in the outside world. Things that could be obtained by waiting for the passage of time were obviously not a problem for the island branches. Because of this, Luo Fan naturally would not waste his energy to take the risk of reminding them. Moreover, even if he did remind them, what could they do? Could it be that they could instantly break through just because they knew this and instantly bring unimaginable benefits to the various island branches? Obviously, this was impossible. Even if they knew this for the transcendents, it would only be able to sweep away some of the doubts in their minds. Chapter 31:31. At this moment, aside from the transcendents who had just appeared, there are also a large number of six tribulation experts among the many islands. Although the cultivation of these six tribulation experts was many times stronger than those who had transcended the world, because they were limited to the branches of the island, their understanding of the many branches of the island was not as good as those who had transcended the world. They did not even discover the existence of those who had transcended. In the senses of those six tribulation experts, these island branches weren't much different from before. They still needed to constantly create space-time, transform it into a world, and finally evolve it into a world. In this manner, layers upon layers of space-time would constantly increase the size of the island branches. However, it was clear that although they didn't know about the existence of the transcendent beings, when the scale of the transcendent beings increased to a certain extent and their influence on the various island branches increased to a certain degree, the six tribulation experts would eventually be able to sense something different through the changes in the island branches themselves. What's going on? It seems like the island branches have come alive. A six tribulation powerhouse felt the changes in the island branch he was on, and such a strange thought flashed through his mind. In his perception, the island branch he was on seemed to be growing on its own. It was as if the island branch would suddenly become stronger unexpectedly every once in a while, just like a living being that would constantly grow on its own. After discovering that something beyond his control was happening, how could this six tribulation powerhouse still dare to be as indifferent as before? At that moment, he focused his attention on the many worlds on the island branch and carefully observed the changes in the many worlds on the island branch. Some of the worlds in this island branch were inherited from the source of this island branch, which was also the island branch of the upper layer. The six tribulation powerhouse could not clearly sense these worlds, and he did not even know how many layers there were in those worlds, let alone determine the minute changes that were occurring in those worlds. However, this was only for the worlds that had originally been inherited from the island branch of the upper layer. As for the other worlds that he had nurtured, he did not have such restrictions at all. He could perfectly grasp all the details and changes of these worlds. At this time, he was completely focused on the worlds that he had nurtured, as well as the situation in the void where these worlds were located. From a certain point of view, his actions were obviously an absolutely wise decision to grasp the main point. Because the six tribulation powerhouse knew that the number of layers of heaven and earth in the island branch would be related to the benefits he would gain from the communication between the island branch and the endless void ocean in the outside world, the six tribulation powerhouse didn't slack off at all in helping the island branch grow. Through his efforts, the number of layers of heaven and earth in the island branch had already exceeded 10 million. Although it wasn't too difficult to grasp all the details and changes of so many worlds, it was clearly a rather complicated task. As such, during this process, the six tribulation powerhouse had no choice but to stop increasing the size of the island. In other words, he stopped increasing the heaven and earth level of this island branch. Once he stopped, tens of thousands of years passed. Over the past tens of thousands of years, he had been sensing the situation of the many worlds he could sense in this branch of the island. At the same time, he was sensing the situation of the void where those worlds were located. After waiting for tens of thousands of years, on this day, what he had been waiting for had finally happened. A new world has appeared out of thin air. No, it's not a real world, but a simplified version. Perhaps it can be called a small world. Moreover, it has the charm of transcendence. This is a small world that has transcended from a certain world. Is this world transcendence? Looking at the small world that had appeared out of thin air, the Sixth Tribulation powerhouse finally understood why he felt that this island branch seemed to have come to life. Someone actually chose to transcend the world, and this island branch actually accepted this kind of transcendence so generously. After understanding the reason, he couldn't help but feel even more surprised. He naturally knew what it was like to transcend the world. He also knew how difficult it was to do so. Normally speaking, unless one had unimaginably deep feelings for a certain area, one wouldn't take that area with him when he transcended. This kind of unimaginably deep feelings was definitely not a normal kind of deep feelings. Instead, it was the kind of deep feelings that required one to treat a certain area as one's own life. Obviously, this kind of cultivator was very, very rare. Cultivators' cultivation was a process of constantly improving themselves and surpassing themselves. Once a cultivator truly set foot on the path of cultivation, his life would become extremely long. During such a long period of time, almost no cultivator would stay in a certain place. Normal cultivators would constantly change their location during the process of cultivation. They would move space by space, world by world, and world by world. They would constantly surpass themselves and improve themselves, and during this process, they would constantly change their location. In this way, whether it was in terms of feelings or interests, it was obviously very difficult for them to have such deep feelings for a certain place. However, when there were enough cultivators, such cultivators would indeed appear. However, no matter what, it was impossible for there to be too many of such cultivators. At least, it was impossible to meet one every tens of thousands of years. But now, such a cultivator had appeared. This kind of transcendence had also successfully appeared before him. With the wisdom of this Sixth Tribulation powerhouse, he quickly understood that this kind of transcendence would bring unimaginable benefits to the cultivators who transcended. Only by doing this would it be possible for so many cultivators to choose to transcend the world. In fact, this kind of transcendence would bring unimaginable benefits to the island branch. Only then would the island branch easily allow these cultivators to transcend. The second point was that this kind of transcendence would bring benefits to the island branch. This kind of transcendence would also bring benefits to the island branch. Just like how he was helping the island branch to continuously expand, the appearance of these transcendents would have a similar effect. The appearance of these transcendent beings represented a new world. Their presence on this island branch was equivalent to providing assistance to the expansion of the island branch. This was naturally not a small benefit for the island branch. As such, the island branch would accept the transcendence of these cultivators and even facilitate their transcendence. However, he could understand the second point. As for the first point, he didn't know what benefits this kind of transcendence would bring to the cultivators who chose to transcend. Since he didn't know what to do, there was no need to say anything else. With a thought, the Sixth Tribulation powerhouse's body flickered, and he arrived outside this world. He looked down at this world, or rather, this small world. At this moment, this small world was constantly absorbing nutrients that the Sixth Tribulation powerhouse could not understand from a void. These nutrients were absorbed into this small world to help it continue to grow, evolve, and transform into a true world. It's not absorbing nutrients from the island branch. Did it appear out of thin air? Or did it absorb nutrients from other places? Looking at this small world, the Sixth Tribulation powerhouse had this doubt in his mind. In his doubt, he faintly felt that he had overlooked something very important. Perhaps there were some secrets that he had neglected for a long time in the bodies of these transcendent beings. This void was the Sixth Tribulation powerhouse's territory. Although he couldn't completely control this void, he had a certain amount of authority here. For example, the fact that he was able to appear here from his original location in the blink of an eye and appear outside this small world was one of the manifestations of this kind of authority. However, this authority didn't include entering and exiting this world. This was because this world wasn't created by him. Moreover, this world didn't truly belong to this void. Even though this small world was a small world, it still had an owner. It was easy for this sixth tribulation powerhouse to destroy this world, but it wasn't so easy to enter and exit this world. At the very least, without the permission of this world's ruler, it would be very difficult for him to directly enter this world. Looking at this small world, the sixth tribulation powerhouse understood this point. Thus, he didn't attempt to enter this world. Instead, he directly sent a strand of his aura into this world. In an instant, this strand of aura directly enveloped this small world. Every living being in this small world could clearly sense this strand of aura belonging to this sixth tribulation powerhouse. The moment they sensed this strand of aura, an indescribable sense of panic spread throughout this small world. What kind of existence was a sixth tribulation powerhouse? For peak seventh tribulation powerhouses like Luo Fan, who had even sensed the arrival of the eighth tribulation, sixth tribulation powerhouses were like ants. However, to those who had undergone the five tribulations and below, such an existence was an absolute powerhouse. Just a strand of aura from such an expert was enough to cause a world to sink and destroy it. Even the owner of this small world, a newly ascended transcendent who had already entered the tribulation, couldn't resist this strand of aura at all. Answer my question. This information was instantly transmitted to the strongest existence in this small world through this strand of aura. In other words, the heart of the transcendent. After sensing the information contained in this strand of aura, the newly ascended transcendent who had just entered the tribulation became terrified without hesitation. Through this wisp of aura, he could clearly tell that the owner of this aura did not even need to do anything. As long as he released the restriction on this wisp of aura, then his small world, which he had paid such a huge price to bring him to transcend, would completely collapse. Even if he reversed time and space, it would not be able to recover. Under such circumstances, how could he resist the will of this strand of aura's owner? Of course, he would obediently become terrified. "Senior, please instruct me," the newly ascended transcendent hurriedly said. As he spoke, he established an extremely subtle connection with this strand of aura. Through this connection, the sixth tribulation cultivator easily cast his gaze into this small world, then directly stared at the newly ascended transcendent. In just an instant, the newly ascended transcendent felt an indescribably terrifying gaze land on him. All of his secrets seemed to be swept clean by this terrifying gaze. So this is the benefit of transcending the world. The moment the sixth tribulation cultivator saw the newly ascended transcendent, he completely understood what was going on. He no longer had any doubts about the benefits that the newly ascended transcendent could obtain from this process. How did you know that transcending the world would allow you to break through? He immediately gave up on his original question and changed the topic. Reporting to Senior, "This is something I comprehended when I was comprehending the world. It seems to be something I obtained when the world I was born and interacted with the other worlds." The newly ascended transcendent answered without hesitation. Facing an expert he couldn't resist, it was better to be obedient. In any case, this information wasn't related to his own secrets, so he could tell it to anyone without any burden. Of course, even if this information was related to his own secrets, he didn't mind telling this information to the sixth tribulation cultivator. After all, with such a difference in strength, what he thought to be a secret might just be superficial in the eyes of the other party. Under these circumstances, offending such a powerful sixth tribulation cultivator for these so-called secrets that didn't have much effect on the other party was simply a foolish choice. The natural exchange between the world and the other worlds? The other worlds? Hearing this, the sixth tribulation cultivator's expression changed slightly. Chapter 31-32. The sixth tribulation powerhouse felt as if the fog in front of him had been swept away. He was well aware of how many worlds there were in an island branch. Even if it was the island branch from the previous round of branching, which was also the source of this island branch, all the world in the branch had been divided into the island branch that he was currently on. In addition to the worlds that he had opened up, the total number of worlds could be calculated in the tens of thousands. No matter what, this number could not be called endless worlds. But at this time, the person who transcended the world was talking about the boundless heaven and earth. There could only be one truth. That was, the worlds that could communicate with those worlds were not limited to this island branch, not even limited to the source of the island branch, but all the worlds in all the island branches. Only such a scale could barely be called endless worlds. Putting himself in their shoes, if he were to call those worlds, they could only be called endless worlds if the scale of those worlds was so large and the number of worlds was increasing at every moment. All the worlds can communicate with the worlds in all the other island branches. This thought emerged in the sixth tribulation powerhouse's mind. At this moment, he suddenly began to envy those transcendent. After all, if that was the case, it meant that the worlds that those transcendent came into contact with were many times larger than his. In fact, the short period of time he exchanged for the exchange of hard work for this island's branch might be something that they could sense at all times. Although in terms of level, the level of communication they sense might be a little lower than what he wanted to sense, it was still somewhat similar. But it was worth paying a great price for it. Transcend the world, transcend the world. At this moment, he could not help but have an inexplicable desire to become such a transcendent. Compared to ordinary cultivators who needed to learn how to transcend the world through the communication between worlds, as a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he did not need to go through this process at all. Although it was rare to see a transcendent, with the knowledge and ability of a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he should know what to do. As he thought of this, he no longer had the intention to waste time with this transcendent being. Without even saying a word, he abruptly withdrew his aura, and his figure directly left the detection range of that small world. That transcendent realm expert was nervously waiting for the next action of that inconceivable expert. However, he did not expect that all the pressure would suddenly disappear without a trace. Everything had been restored to its original state before the appearance of that terrifying expert, causing him to be unable to react for a while. After waiting for a few days, he was finally convinced that the incredible expert had completely let him go. He finally relaxed. There is actually such an incredible expert in the endless world. Sure enough, even a breakthrough is not the end. After relaxing, an inexplicable excitement emerged from the bottom of his heart. Part of the reason why he became a transcendent was that he did not want to leave that area of the world. More importantly, the transcendent could give him a chance to break through the world. In other words, transcending the world was beneficial to his cultivation. Under such circumstances, having the space and opportunity to take a step forward was clearly the greatest encouragement for him. Then, with a thought, he directly pressed the information into the pocket world, allowing the information to spread to every corner of the world through the communication between the pocket world and the other endless worlds, allowing all existences that could absorb information from the world to know that there was such an unimaginably powerful existence in the endless worlds. The reason why he spread this information to the endless worlds was not because he had the spirit of sharing. Rather, he clearly knew that it was not enough to explore the path to take a step forward on his own. Only with a large number of people of the same path could he finally explore the path to take a step forward. And if he wanted more people of the same path to take a step forward, he naturally had to give them enough confidence. Only when they all believed that there was a path to take a step forward, a space to take a step forward, and a possibility to take a step forward would they pour their wisdom and energy into this kind of exploration. It was precisely because of this that he decided to share his findings with others. This information quickly stirred up an intense reaction in the endless world. The first to discover this information were naturally the people who had transcended. Although any world with sufficient cultivation could comprehend the world and obtain the information between the endless worlds, it was clear that only the people who had transcended could sense this information the clearest and the most convenient. After all, other cultivators still had to enter a profound state of resonance with the heavens and the earth in order to sense the various information that existed in the heavens and the earth. As for the people who had transcended, just by existing in the small world that they had transcended, they could sense the information between that world and the endless worlds at all times. In this way, they did not even need to spend any effort to sense it. They only needed to distinguish it, and they would naturally be able to find this information from the endless information. With this kind of convenience, it cannot be more normal for them to know this information before other living beings. After learning this information, the first thing they naturally did was doubt. This was even more normal. They believed that they were already standing at the pinnacle of cultivation. Even breaking through to the Supreme Emperor realm had consumed all of their wisdom and energy. In the end, if they had not used the method of transcending, they would not have even been able to achieve this critical breakthrough. Under these circumstances, they were suddenly told that their current breakthrough was only a breakthrough at an extremely low level, and that there were terrifying experts who were countless times stronger than them. It went without saying how much of a blow this news was to them. This was practically looking down on their intelligence and denying all their past efforts. Even though these supreme transcendents were outstanding existences in their own world, they still couldn't accept such a situation without hesitation. However, there were always traces left behind. The six tribulation experts had clearly left behind too many traces in the endless worlds. Not to mention anything else, most of the worlds that these transcendent experts lived in before they transcended were created by these six tribulation experts. Under such circumstances, there would naturally be countless traces left behind by these six tribulation powerhouses in this world. They did not discover these traces before, not because these traces did not exist, but because they did not think in this direction and did not search in this direction. At this time, when they received information about the possible existence of a sixth tribulation expert from the endless communication between the heavens and the earth, no matter how suspicious they were, it was impossible for them to ignore it. They would naturally think of ways to confirm it and search for traces of the existence of such an incredible expert in everything they could come into contact with. As long as they began to search, these traces would truly appear in front of them. For example, the traces of aura left behind by the six tribulation experts when they created the world. For example, the influence of the six tribulation experts' beliefs on the world. For example, the traces left behind by the six tribulation experts' power in the world. For example, the traces left behind by the six tribulation experts' power in the world. And so on and so forth. As long as one wanted to find these traces, they could find as many as they wanted. If the cultivators of a single world wanted to find these traces, even if they found them, they would not believe that these traces belonged to such incredible experts. However, it was clear that it was not just a small number of such experts who began to search for these traces. A large number of cultivators in the world were also searching for these traces. In that case, when they discovered that there were similar traces in many worlds, and that these traces were faintly different and could complement each other and combine into a more complete whole, no matter how stubborn they had to admit that such a terrifying expert did exist. Moreover, they had to admit that the world they were born in was created by such an expert. From knowing this information to completely confirming it, it only took these supreme transcendents a few days. A few days later, the news that there were unimaginable powerhouses in this boundless world had already become common knowledge. However, after analyzing the countless traces, the cultivators in the endless world began to have another misunderstanding. Can one reach that realm with just one breakthrough? If that's the case, this path might not be as easy to open as imagined. This was the worry of the supreme transcendents who wanted to open a further path. The reason why they were so worried was not complicated. It was because the traces of those unfathomable experts that they had found clearly indicated that even though there were many of them, their levels were not much different. According to their estimations, they should generally be existences in the same realm. In this endless world, apart from tribulation experts like them, the only traces that could be found were the incredible experts in the same realm. In this case, what would the supreme transcendents think? They would naturally feel that as long as they went up this realm, they would be in the realm of the incredible experts. After all, if there really was an intermediate realm, how could so many incredible experts coincidentally be in the same realm? Take them for example. Even though there was an extremely high threshold for this kind of transcendence, those who could ultimately transcend the world were not just peak supreme martial emperors. There were also many false saints and despairing people who created the impossible, leading the area that they cared about to transcend the world and successfully becoming a transcendent being. Even supreme transcendents like them, who had such a high threshold, had different realms. How could these existences who could survive in this endless world and create worlds that will be in the same realm? This realm was actually the only realm above the tribulation experts. Below this realm were the realms they were familiar with. This could explain this phenomenon. Because of this, they had such a misunderstanding. From a certain point of view, this understanding would obviously make it more difficult for them to open a higher path. After all, it was clearly not easy to cross 5 or 6 realms as one realm. However, although opening a path would be more difficult, if they really had great wisdom and perseverance to open such a path, perhaps their future would be so bright that it would be astonishing. While many supreme transcendents were trying to confirm some common sense that they had long ignored, the sixth tribulation expert who had come into contact with the supreme transcendents directly entered the world. He had opened up and began to use his authority to carefully sense this world. The key was the communication between this world and other worlds. There really is communication. After carefully sensing this world, he suddenly discovered the existence of that extremely subtle communication. As the creator of this world, although he only determined a part of the world's concepts, rules, and principles, as well as a part of the great Tao, this was enough for him to have far more authority than the supreme transcendence in this world. With this kind of authority, he could sense even more than those who had transcended the world. Therefore, very soon, he discovered when this kind of communication appeared. Clearly, this kind of communication did not exist from the beginning. At the very least, when he had just opened up this world, this kind of communication did not exist. Otherwise, with his authority, he would have discovered this kind of communication a long time ago. In fact, this kind of communication suddenly appeared out of thin air a period of time ago. To be more specific, it was billions of years ago. It was as if billions of years ago, a subtle change had suddenly appeared on the branches of the unknown islands, causing this kind of communication that did not exist before. Chapter 31-33. Billions of years ago seemed to be the time when those who transcended all over the world appeared. The sixth tribulation expert's heart skipped a beat as he linked the two time points together. According to his investigation, billions of years ago happened to be the time when those who transcended all over the world appeared for the first time. Billions of years ago, there was a communication between heaven and earth that transcended the restrictions of the island branch, which was enough to make him suspect that there was a certain causal connection between the two. It seems that the emergence of those who transcended all over the world has greatly improved these island branches. At this moment, the sixth tribulation expert had already understood. As he understood this, he suddenly felt that the island branch he had stayed in for a long time seemed to hide many more profound mysteries that were far beyond his imagination. At this moment, he suddenly felt that he had chosen to stay in this island branch. If he had made the other choice back then, the deeper mysteries hidden in this island would have had nothing to do with him. Since those who transcended all over the world could have a certain authority that was far beyond that of six tribulation experts, it was impossible for the sixth tribulation expert not to try to become a transcendent himself. At this time, he entered the world he had created in order to try to become a transcendent himself. He did not care about the breakthrough that could be obtained after transcending all over the world, because he clearly knew that such a breakthrough could not happen to him. After all, he was already a sixth tribulation expert, and this was still the sixth level of the Tao Master's road. Perhaps it was possible to break through in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, but it was almost impossible for a cultivator to surpass the level limit and step into a higher level of the Tao Master's path. Even if there was a seventh tribulation powerhouse behind this island branch, it was impossible for him to directly break through the sixth tribulation powerhouse and step into the seventh tribulation powerhouse behind that powerhouse. At least, it was impossible to achieve this with just this island branch, or even all the island branches. What he cared more about when he tried to transcend all over the world was obviously the authority that those who transcended all over the world possessed, the authority that was beyond the coolies like him. As the creator of this world, as long as he wanted to understand it, he could naturally have a deep understanding of this world. Through this understanding, he quickly determined where he should start. With a slight thought, his figure flashed, and he replaced the ruler of a certain force in this world. This was not the kind of replacement that ordinary living beings could imagine. Instead, it was a complete replacement from the very foundation, in terms of karma, in terms of existence, in terms of fate. In other words, from now on, everything in this world would only treat him as the existence that he had replaced, and they would completely forget about the existence that had been replaced. In fact, even if it was the records of the world, even if one transcended time and space to investigate the past and the future, they would only be able to come to the conclusion that he was that existence. There would be no other conclusion. As for the existence that was replaced, it naturally disappeared without a trace. After replacing this existence, he did not hesitate at all. He used the connection between this existence and his faction to directly start the process of transcending the world. Compared to peak supreme emperors, those in despair, and those false saints who had to spend endless time and effort to prepare and plan, it was many times easier for this sixth tribulation powerhouse to start transcending the world. With just a thought, tribulations started appearing. They used all sorts of unimaginable methods to cover him, as well as the areas that he wanted to lead the world to transcend, as if they wanted to completely destroy everything. Such tribulations were enough to make peak supreme emperors extremely nervous. They could even cause them great damage. However, for this sixth tribulation powerhouse, he only needed to wave his hand gently, and the endless attacks from the tribulations were completely eliminated. Not only did the attacks from the tribulations disappear, but the tribulations themselves, the source of the tribulations, also started to collapse and disappear. Not long after, the world became clear again. Then, the endless light of transcendence enveloped the sixth tribulation powerhouse's body. At the same time, it also enveloped the territory of the sixth tribulation powerhouse, completely enveloping the area. It even completely separated it from the outside world, causing it to gradually form a small world of its own. The light of transcendence became denser and denser, more and more intense, and more dazzling. In the end, when it became as bright as the sun, the world shook violently. Then, the small world disappeared along with the sixth tribulation powerhouse. From a moment the sixth tribulation powerhouse started the process of transcending the world to the moment he transcended the world with his territory, the entire process only took a few breaths. From the beginning until now, not many of the other cultivators in the world were able to react and understand what was happening. As for those cultivators who barely managed to react, although they also extended their senses to this location and barely saw the process of the sixth tribulation expert, leading his forces to transcend the tribulation, none of them were able to truly understand what was going on. Some suspected that it was transcendence because the speed was simply too fast. The entire process was completely different from what they knew about transcendence, so they couldn't believe that it was really transcendence. As a result, all sorts of rumors naturally appeared in the world. Some said that this area was punished by the heavens, so it was erased by the world. Some said that the forces in this area dug up something and angered the world, so it was destroyed by the world. Some said that the forces in this area dug up something and angered the world, so it was destroyed by the world. And so on and so on. There were all sorts of rumors, but no one said that this area was transcendence. After all, no matter how daring one was to imagine it, they couldn't believe that such a short period of time would take decades, centuries, or even thousands, or even tens of thousands of years to complete the process of transcendence. But it was actually completed in such a short period of time. Naturally, the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse wasn't interested in the various messages he left in the world. At this moment, he had already stepped into the Transcendence Passage with his territory and headed towards the void on the other side of the passage. When they were in the passage, these six tribulation experts, who already knew about the process of world transcendence, naturally did not waste any time. They immediately began to reconstruct their own sphere of influence. Although this sphere of influence was already like a small world under their initial construction. But in the end, it was not a small world. In the end, the connection between it and that part of the world still existed. Only when they completely broke away from the other world and gained independence could they truly transform into a small world. With the means of the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse, it wasn't difficult for him to transform an area into a small world. In less than a few breaths' time, the area that originally only had a small charm of the world had completely turned into a complete world. There was even a barrier of the world on the surface of the world, making it truly independent and not dependent on anything else. When this small world was completely formed, the Transcendence Passage naturally came to an end. They directly rushed out of the Transcendence Passage and entered a void. From the moment they stepped into the Transcendence Passage to the moment they rushed out, the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse sensed that only a few breaths had passed. Compared to ordinary cultivators who had transcended on their own, this amount of time was countless times faster, let alone compared to other cultivators who had transcended all over the world. It could be said that the time the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse spent in the Transcendence Passageway had once again broken the record for the shortest time a transcendent had spent in the Transcendence Passageway. However, as a Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse, he naturally wouldn't feel any emotional fluctuations over breaking this record. At this moment, he had already used his special authority in this branch of the island to confirm the location of his small world. It was not under the world that he had chosen before, but under the countless worlds that he had constructed. Above the worlds and space-time that he had constructed that had yet to transform into a world, he was in the deepest part of the island branch. In other words, he was in the deepest part of the island branch, the position closest to the absolute void within the island branch. At the very least, from the perspective of the world. So this is the structure. Upon seeing this, the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse couldn't help but come to a realization. He understood the final arrangement rules of this transcendental small world. He also understood why he hadn't been able to sense the existence of these small worlds before. After all, the locations of these small worlds were too subtle. Although they seemed to be inserted into the worlds that he had constructed, because he couldn't directly sense the existence of these small worlds, they didn't exist in his senses. It was similar to the situation in the previous island branch, where there were a large number of Sixth Tribulation Powerhouses in the same island branch. Back then, although those Sixth Tribulation Powerhouses were in the same island branch, they couldn't sense each other at all. Even though the worlds that they had created were closely attached to each other, they couldn't sense the existence of the worlds that weren't created by them, let alone the existence of the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouses who had created those worlds. At this moment, these small worlds that had transcended clearly inserted themselves into their own worlds in a similar way. Of course, compared to the previous situation, the current situation was still different. This kind of isolation obviously wouldn't last long. When these small worlds grew into complete worlds, this kind of isolation would disappear unknowingly, causing these worlds to be brought into the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse's senses once again. It was precisely because of this that the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse had the opportunity to discover the existence of these transcendental beings. It was just that the disappearance of this kind of isolation was too natural, almost silent. As a result, the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse usually didn't discover these worlds appearing out of nowhere. This was like a rice grain suddenly appearing in a bowl of rice. No matter how sharp a person was, they wouldn't be able to discover this so easily. Only when they occasionally glanced over would they discover that there seemed to be something different in the place that originally didn't have a rice grain. Only when they carefully compared it to their memories would they discover that there was an extra rice grain there. Just like what the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse had done previously. After sensing the location of this small world for a while, he began to focus his attention on this small world. More specifically, he focused on the connection between this small world and the other endless worlds. This kind of connection appeared in the form of communication. Endless information continuously flowed out of the endless worlds and poured into this world. At the same time, a lot of information flowed through the information channels and into the other endless worlds. During this process, various changes began to appear in this small world. The world kept growing. The laws were constantly perfected. The great Tao began to take shape, and so on and so forth. All the other factors necessary for a complete world were rapidly perfected through this communication. This situation looked as if the endless world was helping this small world grow at the same time. Is this the power that allowed them to break through? Immediately afterwards, the Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse's heart stirred. He carefully sensed the indescribable charm that had appeared out of nowhere. As this small world constantly communicated with the endless world around it, there was also an indescribable charm that appeared out of nowhere. It descended upon him and continuously seeped into his body and mind. During this process, it seemed to be constantly breaking down some subtle shackles in his body and mind, allowing him to step into an indescribable realm of liberation. However, it was a pity that this charm might be more than enough for a supreme emperor, enough for him to become a tribulation powerhouse. However, for a Sixth Tribulation Powerhouse like him, this charm was far too weak. He even had to sense it extremely carefully to be able to sense the effects of this charm. He even needed to sense it carefully to be able to sense its effects, let alone use it to help him become a Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse. It could be said that even if this charm was 1,000,000 times stronger, it might not necessarily be enough to push his cultivation realm forward. Chapter 31-34. Feeling the effect of this charm, the Sixth Tribulation expert was quite impressed. This charm obviously contained some mystery that he could not understand. This mystery had even given these island branches the power of the Town Master's path to a certain extent. Although this power was only at the first level of the Town Master's path, it was obviously only temporary. There was no such charm before, but now it had appeared. Who knew what the development of these island branches would be like in the future? At least, even the Sixth Tribulation expert had many ideas about the development of these island branches. He had some guesses about how to enhance the power of these island branches in this aspect. Not to mention the existence behind this island branch that was obviously many times more powerful than him. Therefore, he was sure that the current limit of these island branches was not their real limit, but only their temporary limit. Thinking of this, he began to focus on the authority that he had obtained after becoming a worldly transcendent, the ability to communicate with other endless worlds. In an instant, an unprecedented world appeared in front of him. The Sixth Tribulation expert, who could only limit his vision to the island branch where he was, suddenly saw an endless world appear in front of him. This endless world was like an endless number of stars, dotting the boundless dark void. In this endless world, he could even feel tens of thousands of familiar auras. Those auras belonged to other Sixth Tribulation experts. As expected, they have surpassed the island branches. Such a thought flashed through his mind, confirming his previous guess. The worldly transcendent is the real protagonist of these island branches. This thought appeared in the Sixth Tribulation expert's mind. But thinking about it, it seemed to be reasonable. For the island branches, the increase of the world was equivalent to the expansion of their scale, which was equivalent to their own growth. Under such circumstances, the addition of a transcendent realm expert was equivalent to the addition of a new world to the island's branch. Once this direction of cultivation became mainstream, countless cultivators in the endless world would work hard to help these island branches expand in scale and strengthen themselves. If he was the existence behind these island branches, he would also provide a lot of convenience to the countless worldly transcendent. Maybe I should remind them. Slightly moved, the sixth tribulation expert thought. The them he was referring to was not the worldly transcendent, or other cultivators were not even worldly transcendent, but the existence of the sixth tribulation expert like him. It wasn't because he had the spirit of sharing. It was just like how the person who had transcended the world had immediately shared the existence of the sixth tribulation expert. It wasn't because he had the spirit of sharing. The reason why he did so was because he needed companions, needed people like him. After all, although there were so many worldly transcendent in the various island branches, he was the first to become a worldly transcendent as a sixth tribulation expert. What would be the consequences of doing so? How could he utilize this additional authority to the limit? How could he combine this authority with the authority he obtained from helping the island branch to expand in scale to bring greater benefits to himself? Everything was obviously not something he could do on his own. Just this reason alone was enough for him to share the news that a sixth tribulation expert could become a worldly transcendent and obtain an increase in authority. Not to mention, even if he didn't share this information, the other six tribulation experts would know about it one after another in the near future. Compared to letting them discover this information themselves, it was clearly more beneficial for him to share this information with them first. After all, if they discovered this information themselves, it was clearly their own ability and had nothing to do with the sixth tribulation expert. However, if the sixth tribulation expert shared this information with them, then even if they were unreasonable, they would still owe him a favor. Perhaps it would not be much, but it was better than nothing. It was precisely because of these various reasons that he directly shared this information at this time. As for the method to share it, there was no need to mention it. As the creator of the world, he was very clear about how to make the creator of the world interested in the information in one of his worlds. At this time, he directly transmitted a large amount of repeated information to the many worlds that gave him a sense of familiarity. Even if this constantly repeated information appeared in one of the worlds, it would be enough to attract a lot of attention. Moreover, the sixth tribulation expert was not just injecting this information into one of the worlds, but into a large number of worlds at the same time. This way, even if the sixth tribulation experts did not pay attention to the worlds that they had already established, they would definitely notice this information. Things were indeed as the sixth tribulation expert had guessed. As this information was transmitted, the six tribulation experts in different branches of the islands quickly learned of the existence of the worldly transcendent. They also learned about the special authority that the worldly transcendent could obtain from the island branch, or rather, the existence behind the island. After a series of confirmations, it did not take long before the second worldly transcendent at the sixth tribulation level appeared. This was followed by the third, the fourth. In just a few short days, almost all the six tribulation experts in the many branches of the islands had already become worldly transcendent. With this change, the number of worldly transcendent experts at the sixth tribulation level in the endless world was already several times more than the number of worldly transcendent experts of other levels. At first, it was only a worldly transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level, so it naturally did not attract too much attention from the other worldly transcendent experts. After all, the scale of the endless world was so large that it was not surprising that there were some special worldly transcendent experts. But now, as the number of transcendents at the sixth tribulation level had increased to an unknown number of tens of thousands, the situation was completely different. From this moment on, all the worldly transcendent experts instantly discovered that their positions among the worldly transcendent experts had suddenly been pushed to the bottom. The interaction between his own small world and the small worlds, and the small worlds and the small worlds, and the worlds of other transcendents seemed to have become an unequal interaction. The information that the other worldly transcendent experts received from their own small worlds and those of the other worldly transcendent experts kept increasing. Meanwhile, the amount of information that their own small worlds and those of the otherworldly transcendent experts received from their own small worlds and those of the otherworldly transcendent experts kept decreasing. This kind of situation was like the communication between subordinates and their leader. Obviously, if the leader wanted to know, the subordinates could only answer honestly without leaving out any details, not daring to be negligent in the slightest. As for what the subordinates wanted to know, it depended on whether the leader wanted them to know or not. If the leader was willing to let you know, you would naturally be able to know. But if the leader didn't want you to know, unless your methods were brilliant enough, it was impossible for you to know. At this time, the relationship between the transcendent realm experts and the transcendent realm experts of the 6th level was similar to the relationship between subordinates and leaders. As for those supreme, transcending experts of the 6th tribulation level, they simply had no ability to resist. As long as those supreme, transcending experts wanted it, as long as they had it, that information would uncontrollably flow to the small world or world of those supreme, transcending experts. On the other hand, ordinary transcendent transcendents were powerless against the small worlds of transcendent transcendence at the 6th tribulation level. The information they could obtain was merely scraps of information that the transcending experts of the 6th tribulation level didn't care about. Of course, even so, it was more than enough for those who had transcended all over the world. Although the information he obtained was only a fragment of the information revealed by those transcendent experts at the level of 6 tribulation experts, it was just a piece of information. Even so, these scraps of information were enough for these supreme transcendents to feel that they had gained a lot. It was just like the idle chatter between leaders. For those leaders, it was just some gossip and didn't have much meaning. However, to his subordinates, these gossips had a completely different meaning. Perhaps this could increase their knowledge, allowing them to understand how the higher-ups thought, or perhaps they could learn some higher-ups secrets through gossip. In the end, with the help of these secrets, they could gain benefits that they had never dared to imagine before. At this time, this was clearly the case for those supreme transcendents. At this moment, most of the transcendents at the level of the 6th tribulation were just communicating with each other through the authority that was beyond the limits of a certain island. They didn't have much interest in communicating with ordinary supreme transcendents. However, the spirit they revealed in the process of communicating, the perspective of observing heaven and earth, the island's branches, and the perspective of observing cultivation were enough to broaden the horizons of those supreme transcendents and benefit them immensely. Thus, after the transcendent transcendents at the 6th tribulation level began to communicate with each other, the communication between ordinary transcendent transcendents had decreased a lot. Clearly, they were already doing their best to absorb the scraps of information revealed by the supreme transcendence of the 6th tribulation level. All of this had been of great help to them, allowing their understanding of cultivation and their understanding of the path forward to improve by leaps and bounds. When the communication between the supreme transcendence of the 6th tribulation level stabilized and gradually decreased to a normal level, many of the ordinary transcendents had already made great progress. Each and every one of them felt as if they had been reborn and reborn from before. So it turns out that one's own view is so important. Looks like I have to change my previous way of thinking. This thought flashed through the mind of the first supreme transcendent, who was also the ruler of the dynasty. Originally, although he valued his own view, he didn't think that it was very unique. He just felt that there was a certain standard for this view. Collecting such views was like picking up grains of sand from a boundless ocean of eternal sand. With this understanding, he even had the thought of exchanging views with other supreme transcendents. After all, according to this understanding, he could also use the views of other supreme transcendents. In that case, if he were to exchange a relatively perfect concept that he had mastered with them, it would be equivalent to him mastering 2 relatively perfect concepts. And if the number of views exchanged increased to thousands, then the number of relatively perfect views he had would also increase by thousands. In that case, if this kind of exchange was extended to countless supreme transcendence, then perhaps just one relatively perfect view could be exchanged for countless relatively perfect views. In that case, it wouldn't take long for him to collect all the views that could form a relatively perfect view of the world. But now, after understanding the uniqueness of views, he understood that this kind of exchange was meaningless. Perhaps the views of others were relatively perfect to others, but to him, they were meaningless views. They couldn't even be combined with his original views, let alone a perfect combination. Only the views that he concluded based on his own way of thinking, his understanding of the world, his understanding of the heavens and earth, his understanding of the myriad worlds, his understanding of the state of chaos, and even his understanding of the primordial world could be considered as his own views. Only when these countless views were combined could he truly form a unique view of the world that could support him to ascend to an unimaginably high realm. After realizing this, the ruler of the dynasty naturally started to modify his original plan. The intention of exchanging views was immediately erased. Although it was still necessary to communicate with the other supreme transcendence, the focus of that communication was no longer on views. Instead, it was something more abstract that was beyond the views. For example, the direction of cultivation. Naturally, there were many supreme transcendents who had the same understanding as he did. Very soon, the communication between the various supreme transcendents gradually increased, and the focus of their communication also unknowingly shifted to various abstract directions.